There is a certain stillness to the Ice King when you look past the noise. A strange gentleness sits beneath the surface of his chaotic behavior, almost as if the world around him has drifted too far from what he once understood. That quiet undertone is where the roots of his obsession begin, long before the crown began to twist his mind, long before the identity of Simon Petrikov slipped into the background of his own memory. Obsession does not appear as a sudden force in his life. It grows out of fear, grief, and the desperate need to hold on to something that feels real when everything else dissolves. The Ice King's attachment to princesses often appears, on the surface, as a light-hearted nuisance. He swoops down from his icy domain, insisting on companionship no one asked for, declaring love that no one reciprocates. Yet, when this behavior is viewed without judgment, without the comedic framing that softens it, it becomes clear that these gestures are not about desire or power. They are about trying to fill a void that he no longer understands. The crown has rearranged the patterns of his thinking, but the emotional wound beneath the surface is still Simon's, still raw, still searching for connection. When obsession begins in the heart of someone who has lost their past, it grows in unusual shapes. The Ice King does not long for any one person. He longs for the comfort he can no longer recall in detail. The princesses are symbols of warmth, safety, fragility, and companionship. They represent every quality he cannot name, because the part of his mind that knew those names has been buried beneath centuries of magical influence. What remains is an instinct, a pull toward anything that resembles affection, even if it is misguided and unhealthy. In that way, obsession becomes a coping mechanism, a substitute for memories that would have once been enough to sustain him. There is something almost childlike in the way the Ice King pursues these attachments. He is not calculating, he is not cruel. He is searching, grasping, reaching for something that echoes the emotional presence of another person in a life defined by isolation. The behavior becomes repetitive because the fear behind it is constant. When one attempt fails, he tries again, not out of determination, but out of helplessness. It is a pattern of longing that has lost its original meaning. The crown keeps him locked in a cycle where each attempt feels like the first one, even though history repeats itself. This looping pattern is one of the clearest indicators of obsession shaped by memory loss. Without the past to teach him, he cannot learn. Without the ability to truly grow, he repeats himself. Obsession for the Ice King is not about control, it is about holding on to something so he does not evaporate completely. Identity slips through his fingers, memories scatter into fragments, and emotions rise and fall without context. In that unstable state, fixation becomes the closest thing he has to stability. It gives him a direction to move in. It gives him a sense of identity when everything else about who he once was has faded. Every misguided scheme is an attempt to frame himself in relation to others. The Ice King does not know who he is alone, so he seeks companionship not to gain power, but to define his place in the world. When obsession grows out of fear, it becomes shaped by insecurity. The Ice King often lashes out, panics, or spirals into dramatic displays of frustration. These moments are not the behavior of a villain. They are the behavior of someone terrified of losing something they do not even fully remember. His mind leaps to extreme conclusions because his emotional stability has been shattered. Without the clarity of Simon's rational mind, the Ice King has no grounding force to steady him. The crown amplifies his fear, twisting every thought toward desperate longing. When he believes something is slipping away, he reacts as if the world is collapsing, even when the situation is harmless. Obsession thrives in that environment, fed by panic and confusion. It is important to remember that the Ice King's obsession exists alongside genuine capacity for love. The crown did not erase his ability to care. It distorted it. His affection is clumsy, filtered through intrusive impulses and fragmented memories, but it is still rooted in a desire for connection. The tenderness of Simon Petrikov lingers beneath the ice, influencing the Ice King's choices in ways he cannot articulate. That lingering warmth is why his obsession is not malicious. It is why his intentions remain anchored in the search for companionship rather than conquest. His emotional compass was damaged, not destroyed. He chases connection because he remembers, somewhere deep in his subconscious, that it once brought him comfort. The emotional landscape inside the Ice King is crowded with echoes. These echoes are not clear memories. They are impressions, faint sensations that drift to the surface without explanation. A colour, a voice, a small gesture from someone else might trigger a surge of attachment. His reactions often feel sudden and disproportionate because they are tied to emotional memory rather than conscious memory. The body remembers warmth even when the mind does not. Obsession grows in that gap between emotion and understanding, feeding on the longing he cannot explain. The Ice King's solitude plays a significant role in the deepening of his fixation. Living apart from most of U isolates him physically and emotionally. Moments of contact with others are rare and often chaotic. In this barren landscape of interaction, each new encounter becomes precious to him. A single conversation, a small kindness, or even a simple acknowledgement can ignite an intense emotional response. He clings to these moments because they break through the silence that surrounds him. They give him something to replay in his mind, even if the crown twists the memory. Obsession grows stronger when it is one of the only emotional experiences available. There is also a philosophical layer to the Ice King's obsession, one shaped by the nature of identity and memory. When a person loses the narrative of their life, they often try to rebuild it through whatever remains accessible. For the Ice King, the accessible elements are scattered impressions of companionship and love. He tries to recreate these feelings again and again because they serve as building blocks for a sense of self. Without them, he is adrift. The crown suppresses the old narrative of Simon's life, but the emotional traces refuse to disappear. Obsession is his attempt to stitch those traces into something coherent, even if the result is unstable. This instability gives his obsession its unpredictable quality. He shifts rapidly from devotion to frustration, from excitement to despair, because he has no internal framework to regulate his emotions. The crown magnifies each feeling, turning small impulses into overwhelming drives. What should be a moment of sadness becomes a spiral. What should be a moment of hope becomes helpless longing. Obsession thrives in an environment where emotions have no boundaries, where every feeling expands until it fills the entire mind. The Ice King lives in that state constantly, unable to filter or moderate the intensity of his own heart. His fixation on companionship is also tied to the loss of his past relationships. While he cannot articulate it, the absence of someone he once loved leaves an imprint on his psyche. That void becomes the center of his emotional gravity. It pulls at him softly, urging him toward connection, even though he cannot name its source. He seeks a feeling rather than a person. He tries to rediscover the comfort that once defined his world. Obsession becomes a misguided attempt to fulfill a need that no longer has a clear origin. Despite all this, the Ice King remains surprisingly hopeful. His emotional resilience survives the crown's influence. Even after countless failures, he believes that companionship is still possible. His hope is simple and pure, shaped by instinct rather than memory. This hope prevents his obsession from becoming entirely destructive. It softens his motivations, keeps him gentle, even when he acts out of fear or confusion. Hope gives his fixation a strangely tender quality. He wants connection not because he desires control, but because he believes, on some deep emotional level, that love still exists for him somewhere in the world. The Ice King's obsession is not a flaw of character. It is the emotional scar of a man who lost everything, including the part of his mind that could make sense of loss. Obsession fills the space where understanding used to be. It replaces clarity with habit, meaning with instinct. Yet beneath the distortion, there is still the heart of someone who once loved deeply, someone who once cherished connection enough that its absence left a permanent hollow inside him. That hollow shapes every part of his behavior, guiding him unknowingly through cycles of longing and confusion. To understand the Ice King is to see obsession not as a villainous trait, but as a symptom of a life unraveled. It is a torch he carries through the darkness of a fractured identity. It is his attempt to rebuild meaning in a world that no longer resembles the one he once knew. Even when the crown obscures his intentions, the emotional truth beneath his fixation remains the same. He is searching for connection, because connection was once the anchor of his life. Without that anchor, he drifts. Obsession becomes the rope he uses to hold himself together, fragile and frayed, yet still tied to the remnants of who he used to be. Obsession does not live in the Ice King alone. It is intertwined with the crown that has shaped his inner world for centuries. The crown does not simply control him. It influences the architecture of his thoughts, shifts his instincts, alters the emotional weight of memories, and redirects his sense of purpose. To understand the evolution of his fixation, it is necessary to view the crown not as a simple enchanted object, but as a companion that exists within his mind. This companion has its own history, its own desires, and its own relationship with him. Together, they shape an emotional echo chamber where obsession thrives, grows, and sometimes overwhelms his remaining fragments of self. The crown speaks in ways that cannot be understood by ordinary language. It whispers through impulses and emotions rather than words. The influence feels like an instinct that pushes him in particular directions. When he fixates on princesses, it is not because the crown gives him instructions. It is because the crown bends his emotional compass, guiding him toward patterns of attachment that reflect its own history. The crown was created with a purpose that echoes through its magic. That purpose resonates through the Ice King, creating emotional habits that he cannot understand. His mind becomes shaped around the unseen memories of the crown, blending the trauma of Simon and the ancient intentions locked inside the artifact. This fusion of experiences creates a mental environment filled with confusion, longing, and instability. The Ice King often behaves as if he has two emotional centers. One belongs to the man he once was, carrying warmth, care, gentleness, and affection. The other belongs to the crown, carrying fears and impulses that he cannot interpret. When these two emotional centers overlap, they create contradictions. He can feel love and panic at the same time. He can feel comfort and confusion in the same breath. This emotional conflict nourishes obsession, because fixation appears to him as the one feeling that brings temporary clarity. The crown encourages the repetition of emotional impulses, and Simon's old heart encourages the search for comfort. Together, they form a cycle that is difficult for him to break. The crown's influence does not erase Simon's emotions. Instead, it distorts the way he experiences them. Joy becomes erratic, sadness becomes overwhelming, affection becomes intrusive. Emotional regulation disappears. The Ice King experiences feelings at full volume, without the ability to shift between states with ease. This emotional amplification leads to fixation because each feeling becomes consuming. When he feels drawn to someone, the feeling does not fade naturally, it intensifies. The thought loops, spirals, and becomes the center of his attention. He pursues companionship not because he is unaware of boundaries, but because he cannot ease the intensity of his own emotions. Obsession becomes the expression of emotional imbalance. The crown magnifies fear, so he clings to comfort. It magnifies longing, so he searches for connection. It magnifies loneliness, so he seeks out others with urgency. This pattern creates a landscape where emotional extremes feel normal. Each fixation feels like the answer to an overwhelming sense of longing that he cannot interpret. The Ice King acts as though each new attachment will resolve the tension inside him. The crown ensures that this tension never truly disappears. In this way, the obsessive pattern becomes self-sustaining. There is also a layer of magical influence that shapes the Ice King's fixation. The crown functions like an ancient guardian, created long before Simon encountered it. This guardian does not share his goals or desires. Its energy shifts the structure of his thoughts toward patterns of behavior that serve its own internal logic. This internal logic does not care about his emotional well-being. It cares only about maintaining its influence and preserving the magical patterns encoded within it. These magical patterns reinforce repetition in his behavior, encouraging him to act without learning from consequences. Obsession becomes a byproduct of this magical influence. The crown encourages cycles of behavior because cycles require less mental clarity, and clarity would weaken its hold. Simon Petrikov's humanity becomes trapped within these cycles. His old memories exist beneath the crown's influence, like artifacts buried under layers of ice. These artifacts carry emotional weight but lack context. A memory of love might appear without its story. A memory of fear might rise without its cause. When these fragments surface, they create emotional waves that the Ice King cannot understand. His obsession then becomes a way to process these emotional waves. When a fragment of love surfaces, he seeks attachment. When a fragment of fear surfaces, he grasps for reassurance. The crown prevents these emotional waves from forming clear narratives, so he cannot understand why these feelings arise. He only knows that he must respond to them, and obsession becomes his response. The crown also affects how he perceives time. For the Ice King, time often feels disjointed. Moments blend together. Emotional patterns repeat. Days do not form a continuous narrative. Without a stable sense of time, learning from past experiences becomes nearly impossible. He cannot build memories in a linear way. He cannot form long-term understanding of his actions. This lack of continuity feeds into his fixation. Every emotional impulse feels immediate and new because he cannot connect it to past attempts. He repeats the same behaviors because each attempt feels like the first moment a particular feeling has entered his heart. Obsession emerges when feelings appear repeatedly without the memory scaffolding that would normally give them structure. The Ice King's isolation compounds this effect. The crown relies on solitude to maintain its hold. When he is alone, the crown's influence becomes stronger. His thoughts echo inside his mind with no external grounding. Without others to challenge his perception, the crown's impulses become the dominant voice within him. Even when he interacts with others, the crown remains present as a constant emotional filter. Every conversation becomes shaped by its influence. Every attempt at companionship becomes complicated by its emotional distortions. Solitude also increases his reliance on obsession, because fixation becomes his method of breaking through the silence that surrounds him. It gives him something to focus on, something to reach for in the vast emptiness of his home. Obsession also becomes influenced by the Ice King's environment. His domain is quiet, cold, and unchanging. There is little stimulation for him. The landscape offers no emotional variety, no new experiences that might broaden his perspective. In this unchanging environment, small actions take on tremendous emotional weight. A simple visit from someone becomes meaningful. A brief friendship becomes unforgettable. The crown amplifies these emotional impressions, stretching them into patterns that feel larger than they are. The Ice King clings to these impressions because they represent warmth in an otherwise stark world. His obsession grows from the contrast between his cold surroundings and the emotional warmth he occasionally experiences. The crown's influence also manipulates the way he forms attachments. It encourages him to latch onto symbols rather than people. Princesses become symbols of warmth and companionship. Their titles and roles carry emotional significance that the crown amplifies. The Ice King does not fixate on them because of who they are. He fixates on them because the crown encourages him to seek symbols that fit its emotional patterns. These symbols resonate with the fragments of Simon's memories. The blend of magical influence and emotional residue creates a fixation that feels powerful and urgent, even though it is disconnected from the true nature of the individuals he pursues. There is a concept in psychology where obsessions serve as anchors during emotional confusion. The Ice King's fixation functions this way. His mind is constantly shifting, drifting between impulses and fragmented memories. Obsession gives him something stable to focus on. Even if the focus is unhealthy, it provides clarity in a world where everything else feels chaotic. The crown encourages this focus because it benefits from simplicity. A mind caught in a loop is easier to influence. A mind with fewer emotional variables is easier to maintain. Obsession keeps his thoughts within predictable boundaries, which strengthens the crown's hold over him. Despite the crown's influence, the Ice King retains a core emotional truth. The man he once was still exists beneath the layers of magic and distortion. Simon's gentleness shapes the emotional tone of his brime, obsession. Without that gentleness, the fixation would become frightening or harmful. Instead, it remains soft, clumsy, and desperate. It carries the innocence of someone who wants care but does not know how to ask for it. Simon's emotional residue prevents the crown from turning his fixation into cruelty. His actions come from longing rather than aggression, from confusion rather than malice. This lingering humanity reveals itself in rare moments of clarity. These moments occur when the crown's influence weakens, even if only slightly. In these moments, the Ice King experiences a sense of emptiness, as if he has forgotten something important. This emptiness is the shadow of Simon's lost identity. When he feels this emptiness, his obsession intensifies because he is trying to fill the void. The crown takes advantage of these moments, guiding him toward behaviors that reinforce its control. The deeper his emptiness, the stronger his fixation becomes. This cycle continues because the crown never allows him to fully understand what he has lost. Philosophically, the crown acts like a mirror that reflects only fragments of truth. The Ice King sees pieces of himself, but never the whole picture. This fragmented self-image creates a persistent feeling of incompleteness. Obsession becomes his attempt to find the missing pieces, even though he does not know what he is searching for. The crown ensures that he can never find these pieces, because finding them would weaken its influence. The crown encourages him to search endlessly, all while knowing the search cannot end. Obsession thrives in this endless pursuit because it gives him a reason to continue seeking. The Ice King's emotional world becomes shaped by this endless pursuit. His fixation grows not because he desires control, but because he desires understanding. He feels something missing. He senses something lost. He searches for clues in his interactions with others. The crown twists these clues into emotional triggers. He misunderstands affection. He misinterprets intentions. He tries to recreate feelings that exist only as faint echoes in his heart. Obsession becomes the only method he has for exploring the gaps in his identity. In the end, the crown does not create his obsession. It amplifies a wound that already exists. Simon Petrikov was a man who loved deeply, who cared intensely, who valued connection more than anything. When he lost everything, that emotional capacity became vulnerable. The crown stepped into the void, filling it with impulses and distortions. Obsession became the distorted reflection of Simon's lost love, captured inside the Ice King and expanded beyond recognition. The crown acts as the chamber where these echoes grow louder. The Ice King listens to these echoes, believing they represent truth, when in reality they are fragments of a life he can no longer remember. In this echo chamber, obsession becomes the only emotion that feels solid. It becomes his anchor. It becomes his purpose. It becomes the one thread he can follow through the fog of his fractured identity. While the crown continues to shape his emotional world, the heart that fuels his fixation still belongs to Simon. His obsession is the combined product of magical influence and human longing. It is tender, tragic, confused, and deeply rooted in the emotional truth of who he once was. It is both his burden and his lifeline. It keeps him connected to the world, even as it keeps him trapped within himself. Obsession is often understood as a feeling that overwhelms everything else, but for the Ice King, it functions as a boundary rather than an emotion. It becomes the line that separates his unstable present from the scattered remnants of his past. This boundary is fragile, shifting and unpredictable, shaped by the magic of the crown and the emotional imprint of Simon Petrikov. When longing becomes the foundation of identity, every thought, every action, and every impulse is filtered through that singular need. In this fragile state, obsession becomes both a coping mechanism and a structural support, holding together the pieces of a life that has been shattered by time, magic, and memory loss. The Ice King's fixation on companionship is not simply a desire for company. It is an effort to understand who he is. Without his past, he has no reference point for his own identity. The crown provides impulses, but it does not offer clarity. His memories offer emotion, but they do not offer context. These fragmented elements create a state where longing becomes the closest thing to self-awareness he has. He feels drawn to connection because connection was once a defining part of his life. Even though he cannot remember the details, the emotional imprint remains strong. Obsession becomes the emotional language through which he tries to reconstruct himself. Identity normally forms through continuity, through the accumulation of experiences that shape our understanding of who we are. The Ice King cannot rely on this process. His memories do not align in a coherent narrative. A moment of tenderness might surface without warning, carrying a warmth that feels familiar but inaccessible. A moment of fear might appear without explanation, carrying an urgency he cannot understand. These emotional fragments create confusion because they do not fit together. Without continuity, his emotional responses become guided by instinct rather than understanding. Obsession fills the gaps by giving him a sense of direction. When he pursues connection, he feels a temporary sense of identity, as though his longing defines him. This dependency on longing becomes both a comfort and a trap. When his fixation intensifies, it gives him a sense of purpose. He feels as though he is working towards something meaningful, even though the meaning is unclear. This feeling brings temporary relief from the emptiness created by memory loss. However, the crown ensures that this relief is short-lived. The crown amplifies the emotional emptiness that drives his fixation, reinforcing the need to search for what he cannot name. Obsession becomes a cycle because it begins and ends with the same emotion. When he pursues companionship, he feels hopeful. When he fails, he feels emptier. The crown magnifies this emptiness, which leads him to pursue connection again. This cycle creates the illusion of progress, even though he remains trapped within the boundaries of longing. The Ice King's behavior reflects this emotional loop. His actions often appear impulsive because they are driven by emotions that rise without warning. A sudden surge of excitement might lead him to seek out someone he feels connected to, even if he cannot explain why. A sudden feeling of isolation might push him into dramatic displays of longing. These impulses are not random. They are the result of emotional cues that originate from both the crown and the remnants of Simon's memories. When these cues appear, they override whatever the Ice King was doing. The fixation becomes all-consuming because it feels like the only solution to the emotional intensity he experiences. This emotional intensity becomes heightened by the instability of his identity. The Ice King does not know where he ends, and the crown begins. He cannot distinguish between his own desires and the impulses implanted by the crown. This lack of boundaries creates confusion about his true self. Obsession becomes the closest thing he has to personal agency. When he feels drawn to someone, it feels like a decision, even if it is influenced by magical forces. The crown encourages this confusion because it benefits from emotional instability. A stable identity would give him the ability to question the impulses of the crown. A fractured identity makes him more susceptible to influence. Obsession becomes a tool the crown uses to maintain this instability. Even though the crown shapes his emotional landscape, Simon's emotional depth continues to influence how the Ice King experiences fixation. The man Simon once was cared deeply for others. He valued connection and understood intimacy. These emotional traits remain even when the memories behind them do not. When the Ice King feels drawn to companionship, it is a reflection of Simon's emotional truth. The longing is genuine, even if the form it takes is distorted. This blend of magical influence and human emotion gives his obsession its unique character. It is not cold or aggressive. It is warm, confused, desperate, and full of sincerity. The sincerity of his longing is why he remains gentle, even when his fixation becomes intense. The Ice King rarely acts with malice. His behaviors come from a place of yearning rather than cruelty. He believes that companionship will provide comfort, even if he does not fully understand what he is searching for. When his efforts are rejected, he reacts with childlike confusion rather than anger. He does not understand why others do not respond to him the way he expects. This confusion deepens his longing because he interprets rejection as a sign that something is missing within him. Without understanding the true nature of his identity, he blames himself for the emotional distance he experiences. This internal conflict becomes even more complex when moments of clarity surface. There are rare instances when the Ice King feels something like recognition. These moments are brief, fragile, and difficult for him to articulate. They feel like the shadow of a memory that refuses to fully reveal itself. These moments often leave him unsettled, as though he has glimpsed a person he used to be. The crown suppresses these moments quickly, but the emotional residue lingers. This residue increases the emptiness he feels, which strengthens his fixation as he searches for something to fill the void. Philosophically, the Ice King's identity is built around absence. He is defined more by what he has lost than by what he has retained. In this way, obsession becomes his attempt to create presence where there is none. The longing becomes a structure that replaces the memories he cannot access. When he pursues companionship, he feels momentarily present. He feels anchored to something outside of himself. This anchoring becomes essential to his emotional survival. Without it, he feels disconnected from the world and from himself. Obsession becomes an act of self-preservation rather than desire. The Ice King's relationships with others reflect this struggle for identity. He often behaves as though each new attachment has the potential to restore something he has lost. He treats new connections as opportunities to rebuild himself. This expectation creates pressure that others cannot meet. They cannot fulfill the emotional void he carries because they were never part of the life he lost. When these relationships fail to provide the sense of restoration he seeks, his obsession intensifies because he believes he has failed to pursue them correctly. He tries again, hoping each new attempt will be the one that fills the empty space inside him. His emotional vulnerability becomes even more apparent in moments when he tries to express affection. His attempts are often awkward because he does not understand the social dynamics he is reenacting. He imitates behaviors that feel meaningful, even if he cannot explain them. Many of these behaviors reflect rituals of intimacy from Simon's life. They come from emotional memory rather than conscious understanding. He recreates gestures that once signified closeness because they feel important, even though he does not remember why. This imitation becomes another part of his fixation, adding layers of complexity to his emotional world. Obsession becomes the attempt to reenact intimacy without understanding its origins. The crown responds to these emotional expressions by reinforcing the intensity of his fixation. When he seeks connection, the crown interprets this as an opportunity to strengthen its influence. It amplifies his longing, making each gesture feel more urgent. This urgency pushes him to act impulsively, often without considering how his actions might affect others. He is not being inconsiderate. He is overwhelmed by feelings that he has no means of moderating. The crown manipulates these feelings to maintain control, using his own emotional depth as the foundation of its influence. In this way, the Ice King becomes both the victim and the carrier of obsession. His longing is genuine. His emotional needs are real. The crown twists these needs into patterns that benefit its influence, but it does not create the longing itself. The longing comes from Simon's humanity, from a man who once loved deeply and valued connection above all else. This love survives in the Ice King, even when his identity does not. The crown cannot erase it because it is embedded in the emotional structure of his heart. Obsession becomes the distorted expression of this love, shaped by magic, but rooted in truth. The fragility of his identity becomes most apparent when he is confronted with kindness. Genuine kindness often confuses him because it feels familiar in a way he cannot explain. When others show him warmth, it stirs emotional memories that rise without context. These moments make him feel connected, but they also make him feel vulnerable. The crown reacts to this vulnerability by pushing him into obsessive behaviors. The crown wants him to cling to these moments, to amplify their significance, to wrap his identity around them. This reaction reinforces the idea that obsession is his path toward fulfillment. In reality, it is the crown's method of maintaining control. The Ice King's story reveals how obsession can grow when identity collapses. When a person loses their sense of self, longing becomes a substitute for understanding. For the Ice King, longing becomes the foundation of selfhood. It becomes the lens through which he interprets the world. It becomes his emotional compass, guiding him toward connection, even when the connection cannot fulfill him. His obsession appears irrational because it is built on a fractured understanding of his own identity. He is searching for the person he used to be, and he is using emotional cues as his guide. The tragedy of his fixation lies in the fact that he is closer to authenticity than he realizes. His longing reflects the love Simon once carried. His fixation reflects the emotional depth that defined his humanity. These qualities remain intact beneath the crown's influence. Obsession becomes distorted, but its origins are pure. It is the shadow of a life that was filled with love and connection. The Ice King does not know this, but the emotional truth remains. The longing he feels is the last surviving piece of his identity, the fragment that continues to echo even when the rest has disappeared. His obsession is a fragile boundary. On one side lies the emptiness created by memory loss. On the other lies the emotional imprint of the life he lost. He stands in the space between these worlds, guided by longing and influenced by magic. This boundary shapes his entire existence, creating patterns of behavior that appear strange, humorous, or misguided from the outside. Yet when viewed from within his emotional world, these patterns reveal a man trying to hold on to the last remaining part of his identity. He seeks connection because he believes it will make him whole. The crown distorts this belief, but it cannot erase the sincerity behind it. In this fragile space, the Ice King continues to search. His obsession remains the thread that ties him to his emotional truth. It is his attempt to navigate the world with a heart that remembers love even when his mind does not. It is the expression of a longing that survived the collapse of identity. It is his method of reaching across the empty spaces within himself, hoping to find something familiar. The boundary between longing and identity may be fragile, but it is the closest thing he has to a sense of self. He clings to it because it is all that remains of the man he once was. The Ice King's obsession cannot be understood without looking at the environment inside his mind, the quiet corridors of thought where his emotions echo endlessly. His inner world is shaped by absence, silence, confusion, and traces of memories that rise like shadows without context. It is a landscape constructed from longing, lit by the dim light of forgotten affection. Obsession does not simply grow within him, it grows around him, shaping the very architecture of his emotional life. To understand why he fixates so intensely, it is necessary to explore the internal environment that makes fixation feel like the only path he can follow. This inner world feels cold, not because he is cruel, but because the warmth he once had has been sealed away. The crown created this coldness, isolating his thoughts from the emotional stability he once enjoyed. The Ice King wanders through this inner space, without guidance, following feelings that rise suddenly and without explanation. These feelings act as markers in a landscape that has no clear structure. When he experiences longing, it becomes one of the only emotional signals strong enough to guide him. Obsession becomes his map, his compass, and his guide through the disordered structure of his mind. The Ice King's emotional architecture is shaped by fragmentation. Instead of coherent memories, he carries impressions. A silhouette of someone he loved, a sensation of warmth, a flash of fear. These fragments exist like broken pieces of stained glass scattered across a floor. Each piece catches light in its own way, creating flashes of emotion that feel powerful but disconnected. When these pieces glimmer, they create emotional surges that he cannot interpret. Obsession forms around these surges because they feel important. They feel like clues. They feel like something he is supposed to follow. In this fragmented space, obsession becomes a way of organizing emotion. It gives structure to feelings that would otherwise drift without context. When longing rises from a memory fragment, he interprets it as a direction. He follows it because it feels purposeful. The crown enhances the intensity of these fragments, pushing them to the forefront of his awareness. This amplification turns faint impressions into overwhelming impulses. The Ice King believes these impulses hold meaning because they feel strong even though they lack clarity. Fixation gives these impulses a shape, turning fragments into a narrative he can follow. The loneliness within his mind becomes a critical factor in the rise of obsession. His inner world feels empty, full of long stretches of silence. Without memories to fill his thoughts, he feels emotionally weightless. The few emotions that do appear become amplified simply because the silence around them is so vast. Longing resonates through this emptiness, like a single note in a quiet room. In such a space, even faint emotional signals feel loud. Obsession becomes a method of breaking through this loneliness. When he fixates on someone, it gives him something to hold on to, even if the connection is imagined. The Ice King's loneliness is not the loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of disconnection from self. He does not simply miss companionship. He misses the connection he once had to his own identity. Without this connection, he feels incomplete. His fixation becomes an attempt to fill the emptiness within him, an emptiness created by the loss of Simon Petrikov's memories. Even though he cannot recall who Simon was, the emotional void left behind becomes the deepest part of his inner world. This void shapes the structure of his fixation. It pushes him outward, searching for something to fill the space where his identity once lived. The crown's influence adds another layer to this architecture. The crown acts like a presence that occupies part of his mind. This presence is ancient and heavy, pressing against his thoughts with impulses that feel foreign. The crown's energy creates a pressure within him, pushing his emotions outward and intensifying them. This pressure distorts his responses to emotional fragments. When he feels affection, the crown magnifies it until it becomes fixation. When he feels fear, the crown intensifies it until it becomes panic. Obsession arises from the crown's influence, because fixation becomes one of the only ways he can manage the emotional pressure. Even though the crown shapes his inner world, Simon's emotional remnants shape its tone. Simon's capacity for tenderness influences the way the Ice King experiences longing. The longing is gentle rather than aggressive. It carries the warmth of a man who once loved deeply. This warmth softens the crown's influence, preventing obsession from becoming destructive. It creates a strange combination of confusion and sincerity. His fixation becomes both tragic and touching, filled with the emotional truth of someone who still carries love in his heart, even when he cannot remember who he loved. These emotional remnants often appear as sensations rather than memories, a sense of closeness, the feeling of holding someone's hand, a moment of shared laughter. These sensations are powerful but context-free. They drift through his mind, stirring emotions that he cannot understand. When these sensations rise, they create a longing that has no target. The crown interprets this longing as a cue, pushing him toward new attachments. The Ice King believes these impulses are genuine desires because he cannot distinguish between emotional memory and present feeling. Obsession becomes his method of responding to sensations he cannot explain. The architecture of his mind also includes areas of forgotten fear. These fears are tied to the collapse of his identity, to the feeling of slipping away from himself. When he senses this fear, he searches for reassurance. Fixation becomes his way of chasing security. Even though his pursuits often lead to confusion, they make him feel briefly grounded. The crown uses this vulnerability to reinforce obsessive patterns. It encourages him to cling to emotional triggers, to repeat behaviors that create a sense of temporary safety. These patterns become the pathways within his inner world, guiding him through the same emotional loops. The Ice King's imagination becomes another component of his emotional landscape. His mind often creates fantasies that give structure to his longing. These fantasies are not self-indulgent. They are attempts to build identity. When he imagines relationships, he creates contexts for the emotional fragments he carries. These imagined contexts help him feel connected to something, even if the connection is not real. Obsession grows within these fantasies because they provide emotional structure. The crown encourages these fantasies because they soften the emptiness within him. His imagination becomes a protective layer within the cold architecture of his mind. His desire for companionship becomes tied to these imaginative structures. He often behaves as though he already has a connection with someone, simply because he has imagined it. This confusion arises from the blurred boundary between emotional memory and fantasy. When he imagines affection, the emotion feels genuine. The crown amplifies this feeling, convincing him that the imagined connection is real. Obsession becomes the attempt to bridge the gap between fantasy and reality. He pursues relationships that exist in his mind, believing that the emotional truth behind them must reflect something real. The Ice King's inner world is also shaped by nostalgia. He feels nostalgic for a life he cannot remember. This nostalgia appears as a soft ache, a gentle sadness that colours his emotional world. It is not tied to any specific memory. It is tied to the feeling of having once belonged somewhere. This nostalgia fuels his fixation because it makes longing feel familiar. When he feels drawn to someone, he believes he is rediscovering something from his past. The crown feeds this nostalgia, encouraging him to interpret longing as memory. Obsession becomes the attempt to reconnect with a past he cannot access. Despite this emotional complexity, the Ice King's inner world contains small pockets of joy. These pockets appear unexpectedly, often triggered by simple pleasures. Music, creativity, friendships that arise sporadically, or acts of kindness can create moments of warmth. These moments offer stability, even if briefly. They show that his emotional capacity remains intact. Obsession becomes less overwhelming when he experiences genuine joy. These moments reveal the delicate balance between longing and contentment within him. They remind him of the emotional truth he carries, even if he cannot understand its origins. These moments of joy also reveal the resilience of his heart. Even after centuries of instability, confusion, and emotional distortion, he remains capable of affection. He remains capable of care. Simon's emotional strength survives within him, shaping the way he interprets the world. This resilience becomes one of the few stable elements within his inner world. It softens his fixation, preventing it from turning into resentment or anger. His obsession remains tender because his heart remains tender, even when his mind is fractured. The architecture of his inner world becomes more apparent when he interacts with others. Conversations confuse him because his emotional responses do not align with social cues. He often interprets kindness as affection. He interprets neutrality as rejection. These misinterpretations stem from the emotional structures within him. When he feels longing, he searches for signals that confirm it. When he feels emptiness, he becomes sensitive to any sign of distance. Obsession becomes his attempt to interpret these signals. He builds narratives around his emotional reactions, believing they reveal truth even when they do not. The crown reinforces these narratives by amplifying emotional cues. If he senses warmth, the crown intensifies it. If he senses distance, the crown magnifies his fear. These amplifications make it difficult for him to understand reality. Obsession becomes the distorted lens through which he views his relationships. He believes his emotional intensity is matched by others, even when it is not. This misunderstanding creates tension, but it also reveals the sincerity of his longing. He wants connection so deeply that he sees possibility in every interaction. The Ice King's inner world is not entirely defined by confusion. There is a quiet intelligence beneath the surface. His fragmented mind still contains curiosity, creativity, and insight. These qualities allow him to navigate his emotional world with surprising adaptability. He may not understand his fixation, but he feels it honestly. His sincerity gives him a form of emotional integrity. Even when his actions are misguided, the emotions behind them are real. Obsession becomes a flawed expression of genuine feeling, shaped by the environment within him. Understanding the Ice King's inner world reveals that his fixation is not a flaw, but a consequence of emotional survival. His mind is a place where memories fade, emotions intensify, and identity slips away. Obsession becomes the thread that keeps him connected to himself. It becomes the structure that holds his world together. It becomes the language through which he expresses the emotional truth that Simon Petrikov left behind. It is tender, tragic, sincere, and rooted in the deepest part of who he once was. There is a force inside the Ice King that pulls at him constantly, a soft but unrelenting gravity that shapes his thoughts, his impulses, and his desperate search for connection. This gravity does not come from the crown. It does not come from his environment. It comes from the emotional imprint of a love he can no longer remember, a love that once defined Simon Petrikov's life so completely that even centuries of magical distortion cannot erase its influence. This lost love becomes the quiet center of everything the Ice King feels. It creates the emotional vacuum that obsession tries to fill. It becomes the unspoken foundation of his longing. Even though the Ice King cannot recall the person he once loved, the emotional weight of that connection remains inside him. It exists as a warmth without origin, a longing without shape, a memory without form. This emotional presence feels familiar to him in a way that nothing else does. When it stirs, he feels drawn toward companionship, because companionship feels like the missing piece. He does not understand the source of this feeling, but he trusts it because it feels true. It feels like something that used to be important. Obsession begins at the point where this emotional truth collides with the confusion created by the crown. The feeling of lost love becomes a quiet ache in his chest, an unresolved sadness that floats beneath the surface of his thoughts. This sadness does not have a name, and that absence makes it even more powerful. He feels the pull of a story he cannot read, a relationship he cannot recall, a devotion he cannot explain. When he senses this ache, he tries to interpret it through the only emotional language he has left. He searches for companionship, because companionship feels like the answer to the ache. His fixation becomes the attempt to recreate a feeling that once came naturally to him. The emotional gravity of lost love influences how he interprets every interaction. When someone acknowledges him, the warmth of that moment resonates with the imprint of his lost love. It feels significant. It feels familiar. It feels like something he has experienced before. The crown magnifies this resonance, pushing him toward fixation. The Ice King believes the feeling is a sign, a clue pointing toward the connection he once had. This misinterpretation is not foolish. It is the logical response of someone whose memories have been removed, but whose emotional truth remains intact. Obsession becomes his attempt to reconnect with a feeling that has no visible source. Because the emotional imprint of Simon's love remains strong, the Ice King feels longing with unusual intensity. His heart responds as though he still loves deeply, even though the person who inspired that depth has faded from his memory. This creates an emotional imbalance that floods his inner world. He has the capacity to love, but not the context, the warmth, but not the memory. The result is overwhelming longing that demands expression. Obsession becomes the path through which the longing finds release. He drifts toward attachment because his heart remembers how to love, even when his mind cannot access the story behind that love. The emotional gravity also shapes his misunderstanding of intimacy. When someone shows him kindness, he feels a spark that resembles the emotional truth he carries. This spark feels like recognition. It feels like he is standing at the edge of a memory he cannot grasp. The crown encourages him to chase the spark, magnifying it into a larger emotional experience. The Ice King interprets this feeling as a bond. He believes he is rediscovering something important because the emotion feels too familiar to be new. Obsession grows in this space where emotional memory and magical distortion collide. The emotional gravity pulls him toward people who resemble warmth. This resemblance may be small, a gesture, a tone of voice, a moment of empathy. These small details resonate with the emotional residue of Simon's past. They remind him of something he cannot name. When this resonance occurs, the crown pushes him to act on it. The Ice King believes the feeling is genuine connection. He pursues it with sincerity, unaware that the connection exists within him rather than between him and the other person. Obsession becomes the attempt to externalize an emotion that originated in a lost memory. The emotional weight of Simon's love also influences the way the Ice King experiences fear. When he feels the ache of longing, he also feels a fear of losing something again, even though he does not know what was lost. This fear becomes intertwined with his fixation. He clings to attachments because he fears the return of emptiness. The crown amplifies this fear, pushing him to act impulsively. Obsession becomes shaped by the need to protect himself from a loss he cannot understand. His behavior may appear irrational, but it emerges from a genuine emotional wound that has never healed. This wound is not visible even to him. He does not recognize it as grief. He does not understand that he is mourning someone he cannot remember. Yet the emotional truth of grief remains. It shapes his longing, colors his impulses, and turns small interactions into significant events. The emotional gravity of lost love creates a deep sadness within him that he tries to escape. Obsession offers temporary relief. It gives him something to reach toward. It makes him feel connected to something outside himself. Even when his fixation leads to failure, the pursuit itself gives him a sense of meaning. The sadness at the core of his inner world makes him exceptionally vulnerable to emotional cues. When someone speaks to him gently, the emotional imprint of Simon's past responds with gratitude. When someone rejects him, the same imprint reacts with despair. His heart does not understand nuance. It responds to every emotional signal with intensity because it is trying to reconnect to a feeling it cannot fully access. Obsession becomes shaped by these reactions. Each moment of warmth intensifies his fixation. Each moment of distance deepens the ache, which in turn strengthens the fixation as he tries to escape the sadness. The emotional gravity also influences how he processes gratitude. When someone helps him, he feels the warmth of gratitude with great force. This warmth resembles the emotional truth of love, so the Ice King interprets gratitude as affection. The crown magnifies this interpretation, pushing him to respond with fixation. He believes the help carries deeper meaning because the emotion feels familiar. He does not understand that gratitude and affection are different. His emotional world does not contain the distinctions he once understood. Obsession becomes his misunderstood expression of gratitude because the emotion feels larger than his fractured identity can process. Even though the Ice King cannot articulate his sadness, he expresses it in small gestures. When he plays music alone, the tenderness in the melody reveals the emotional truth he carries. These moments show the depth of the love that remains inside him. They reveal that Simon's emotional world has not vanished. It has only been hidden. The Ice King's fixation carries traces of this emotional depth. Even his misguided actions reflect an authentic longing for connection. Obsession becomes the external expression of an internal love that refuses to disappear. This emotional depth also influences the way he creates stories about himself. He imagines narratives where he is loved, valued, or admired. These narratives are not rooted in arrogance. They are attempts to recreate the emotional security he once felt. He does not remember the person who loved him, so he constructs stories that echo that experience. When he places himself at the center of these stories, he is trying to rebuild the emotional framework that Simon once lived within. Obsession becomes part of this reconstruction. He focuses on people he believes can play the role of emotional anchor, even if they do not understand the depth of the role he assigns them. The emotional gravity also shapes his dreams. Even though his waking mind cannot access Simon's memories, fragments of those memories surface in his subconscious. These fragments create dreams filled with feelings he cannot explain. In these dreams, he often senses the presence of someone important without recognizing them. He wakes with a sensation of loss, a lingering sadness that he cannot trace. This sadness deepens his longing because it feels like he has been separated from something precious. Obsession becomes the attempt to respond to the emotional truth revealed in dreams. The emotional imprint of lost love also influences how he perceives himself. He often feels incomplete, as if something fundamental is missing from his identity. This feeling shapes his view of the world. He interprets the emptiness within him as a signal that he should be searching for something. The crown twists this interpretation into fixation, but the root emotion comes from Simon's heart. The Ice King feels incomplete because he is incomplete. The love that once anchored him is no longer present in his mind, but it remains present in his heart. Obsession becomes his attempt to restore wholeness. This search for wholeness pushes him toward attachments that resemble emotional stability. He often gravitates toward people who embody strength, kindness, or warmth. These qualities reflect the emotional presence of the person Simon once loved. Even though he cannot articulate the reason for this attraction, his heart recognizes these qualities. The crown magnifies the attraction, turning emotional resonance into fixation. Obsession becomes the attempt to rebuild stability by connecting with someone who reflects the emotional world he once lived in. The emotional gravity of lost love also influences how he reacts to rejection. Rejection feels devastating because it confirms the emptiness within him. It makes him feel as though he has failed to retrieve something important. The crown amplifies this devastation, pushing him to interpret rejection as evidence that he is incomplete. This interpretation deepens his sadness, which intensifies his fixation as he searches for something to escape the pain. His reactions may appear exaggerated, but they reflect the emotional truth of someone who is mourning without knowing why. Despite the pain he carries, the emotional imprint of Simon's love gives the Ice King a quiet resilience. This resilience appears in moments when he shows kindness, even when he is not understood. It appears in moments when he helps others without seeking anything in return. It appears in the tenderness he expresses, in rare moments of clarity. These moments show that the core of Simon's humanity has survived. This humanity gives his fixation its gentle tone. It prevents his obsession from becoming cruel. It reveals that love continues to shape him, even when he cannot remember the person who inspired it. The emotional gravity of lost love becomes the silent foundation of his existence. It shapes his longing, his fixation, his confusion, and his hope. It creates the pull that guides his heart even when his mind is fractured. Obsession becomes both a symptom of this lost love and a reflection of the emotional truth he carries. It is the attempt of a man who once loved deeply to rediscover connection in a world where his memories have been erased, but his heart still remembers. The Ice King's story becomes more tragic and more beautiful when this emotional gravity is understood. His fixation is not madness, it is mourning. His longing is not foolish. It is the expression of a heart that refuses to forget what love feels like. His obsession is not a flaw. It is the echo of devotion that survived the collapse of his identity. In this quiet, emotional landscape, the Ice King continues to search for warmth, because warmth is the last piece of Simon Petrikov that remains intact. It is his emotional truth, his hidden memory, and the gravity that shapes his every action. Companionship sits at the heart of the Ice King's fixation, but companionship carries a dual meaning for him. It represents both comfort and danger. He longs for closeness with the intensity of someone who has forgotten what closeness feels like, yet he fears what might happen if someone truly understood him. This fear is subtle, almost invisible beneath his eccentricities, but it shapes the way he interacts with others. It shapes the way he forms attachments, the way he interprets affection, and the way he loses himself in longing. Understanding his obsession requires understanding this quiet contradiction that lives within him. Companionship feels like salvation, but it also feels like exposure. The Ice King's desire to be known comes from the emotional truth of Simon Petrikov. Simon once lived in a world where he could express himself openly. His heart was gentle, his curiosity bright, and his love sincere. These qualities remain inside the Ice King, but they exist without context. He still wants to be seen, understood, and loved, but he does not remember why these desires feel so natural. He feels an instinctive pull toward intimacy, driven by emotional residue that has survived the collapse of his memories. This pull becomes the foundation of his fixation. He searches for someone who can understand him instinctively, someone who can see through the confusing layers of his current identity. At the same time, the crown has created a fear that coexists with this longing. When someone looks at him with confusion or concern, he feels exposed. He senses that there is something within him that he does not fully understand. This fear is not about external judgment. It is about the possibility that someone might uncover parts of himself that he cannot access. The crown hides Simon's identity from him, but it does not hide the emotional pressure of that loss. The Ice King feels a vague sense of danger when others look at him too closely. Obsession becomes a way of managing this conflict. If he can control the terms of connection, he feels safer. If he can direct the relationship through fantasy and longing, he avoids the risk of being truly known. This conflict creates a fragile balance within him. He seeks out companionship because he needs emotional anchoring, yet he often sabotages genuine closeness because it makes him feel vulnerable. When someone tries to engage him with kindness, he sometimes panics. His reactions become exaggerated because he cannot interpret the meaning behind the kindness. The crown amplifies his uncertainty, turning simple emotional cues into overwhelming signals. Obsession becomes the middle ground between longing and fear. It allows him to focus on companionship without confronting the deeper layers of his identity. This fear of being known also influences how the Ice King interprets rejection. When someone distances themselves from him, he convinces himself that they simply failed to understand him. This belief protects him from facing the painful truth that his fractured identity makes connection difficult. It allows him to preserve his longing without confronting the vulnerability beneath it. Obsession becomes the safe space where he can imagine relationships without the threat of emotional exposure. His fixation is not on real connection. It is on imagined connection that feels safe because it exists within the boundaries of his control. Companionship for the Ice King becomes a mirror. When he fixates on someone, he projects emotional truths onto them. These truths do not belong to the person he pursues. They belong to Simon. The warmth he feels is Simon's. The tenderness he expresses is Simon's. The yearning for someone to understand him comes from Simon's emotional world. The Ice King believes he is seeking a new connection, but in reality, he is seeking a reflection of the emotional depth he once possessed. Obsession becomes the attempt to recreate the mirror that once reflected his true self. This projection shapes his behavior in ways that often confuse others. He interprets neutrality as interest because his emotional world is so starved for affirmation that even a small gesture feels significant. He interprets friendly behavior as intimacy because he believes that emotional warmth must indicate deeper meaning. These interpretations come from the mirror he carries inside him. He sees reflections of his own emotional truth rather than the intentions of others. Obsession becomes the attempt to interact with these reflections, to engage with the emotional world that no longer exists outside of him. The mirror metaphor extends even further when considering how he responds to emotional distance. When someone rejects him, the reflection disappears. This disappearance feels catastrophic because it removes the emotional anchor he was relying on. The crown amplifies this emotional collapse, pushing him to intensify his fixation as a way to restore the reflection. This pattern creates another emotional loop. He pursues connection because he needs emotional grounding. When the connection is denied, he panics. His fixation grows because the reflection has vanished, and he believes he must chase it to feel complete again. Within this loop, the Ice King experiences companionship as both relief and threat. When he receives attention, he feels hopeful. When he senses distance, he feels exposed. This duality creates confusion that deepens his attachment. He believes the confusion is part of the relationship rather than part of his fractured identity. The crown encourages this misunderstanding, pushing him toward fixation rather than reflection. Obsession becomes his solution to emotional complexity. It simplifies the world into a single pursuit where he can focus his longing without confronting his fear. This fear of being known also affects the way he expresses affection. He often shows affection through grand gestures rather than quiet moments. This is not because he lacks emotional subtlety. It is because subtlety requires self-awareness, and his fragmented identity prevents him from understanding the deeper layers of his own feelings. Grand gestures are simpler. They allow him to express longing without examining the vulnerability beneath it. They allow him to focus on action rather than introspection. The crown encourages these exaggerated displays because they override subtle emotional cues that might lead him toward clarity. Obsession becomes the path of least resistance, the emotional strategy that requires the least amount of self-understanding. Despite this, there are moments when the Ice King displays surprising clarity about companionship. These moments occur when he observes others forming connections that feel familiar to him. When he sees genuine kindness, trust, or intimacy between others, he feels a pang of recognition. This recognition comes from Simon's emotional world. It reminds him of something he cannot remember. It reveals the shadow of the love he once had. These moments deepen his longing while exposing his vulnerability. The crown reacts to this vulnerability by intensifying his fixation, shifting his focus toward new targets of obsession. This shift acts as a protective mechanism, distracting him from emotional clarity that might destabilize the crown's hold. These moments of recognition also reveal the Ice King's capacity for empathy. Even though he struggles to understand interpersonal dynamics, he responds emotionally to displays of affection between others. This response shows that Simon's empathy remains intact. It lives within him as a quiet force, shaping his desire for companionship even when he cannot express it clearly. Obsession grows from this empathy because he longs to participate in the emotional world he witnesses. He sees connection in others and feels the ache of exclusion. He tries to insert himself into these moments, hoping to feel the warmth he senses but cannot access. His empathy also influences how he responds when others show him patience. When someone treats him gently, he feels a profound sense of gratitude. This gratitude feels overwhelming because it echoes Simon's emotional truth. The Ice King interprets it as affection because he does not understand how to differentiate these emotional signals. The crown amplifies the confusion, pushing him to respond with fixation. He believes the gratitude indicates deeper connection because the emotion feels familiar. Obsession becomes the outward expression of internal gratitude that has lost its meaning. The fear of being known becomes more apparent in moments when he experiences clarity. When the crown weakens, even for a moment, he senses the emotional weight of his past. These moments are rare and delicate. They do not provide him with memories, but they give him a glimpse of the emotional depth he once understood. This glimpse creates fear because he feels the presence of someone he cannot identify. The emotional truth of his past becomes a shadow that haunts him rather than comforts him. The crown responds to this fear by strengthening its influence, pushing him back into fixation. Obsession becomes the shield that protects him from confronting the emotional truth he is not ready to face. Companionship for the Ice King becomes an emotional puzzle. He solves it not through understanding, but through instinct. His instinct tells him that connection is essential. His fear tells him that connection is dangerous. His heart tells him that he has loved before. His mind tells him that he cannot remember who he loved. These conflicting signals create an emotional tension that shapes his fixation. Obsession becomes the attempt to reconcile the tension, even though reconciliation is impossible without the memories he has lost. The mirror of companionship reflects his fragmented identity. He sees echoes of Simon in the people he fixates on. He sees shadows of emotional truth that he cannot name. He sees possibilities that feel familiar, even when they are not real. Obsession becomes the attempt to make the reflection solid, to turn emotional resonance into tangible connection. It becomes his way of searching for himself through the people he fixates on. He believes that if he finds the right person, he will feel whole again. This belief drives his pursuit even when he experiences repeated rejection. This pursuit reveals the depth of his emotional resilience. Despite centuries of confusion, instability, and magical distortion, he continues to believe in the possibility of companionship. This belief shows the strength of Simon's heart. It shows the enduring power of the love that shaped his past. His fixation may be misguided, but the emotional truth behind it remains pure. He continues to search for connection because connection was once the foundation of his life. Even in his fractured state, he carries the memory of emotional truth through instinct rather than recollection. In the end, the mirror of companionship reveals both the tragedy and beauty of the Ice King's longing. His fixation is not a sign of madness, but a sign of emotional survival. It reflects the love he once felt, the vulnerability he cannot face, and the hope that continues to guide him. He reaches outward because his inner world is filled with shadows of emotional truth that he cannot understand. He searches for someone to reflect the person he once was. He chases the warmth that survived, even when his memories did not. His obsession becomes the delicate thread that connects him to the emotional truth of Simon Petrikov. The Ice King lives inside a world of fantasy as much as he lives inside the world of ooh. These fantasies are not mere stories he tells for amusement. They are emotional refuges that help him survive the instability inside his mind. When reality becomes overwhelming or confusing, he retreats into imagined worlds where he can control the narrative, shape relationships, and create a sense of belonging that he cannot find in his everyday life. Fantasy gives him comfort. It gives him structure. It gives him the illusion of emotional security. His obsession grows in the space where fantasy becomes a substitute for intimacy, where imagined companionship feels safer than the vulnerability of real connection. Fantasy for the Ice King is not an escape from responsibility. It is an escape from confusion. When he experiences emotional signals without understanding their source, fantasy offers a way to interpret them. These imagined scenarios allow him to turn vague feelings into coherent stories. He feels longing, so in his fantasies, someone returns that longing. He feels sadness, so in his fantasies, someone comforts him. He feels fear, so in his fantasies, he becomes the hero who protects others. These stories do not reveal arrogance. They reveal the need to give emotional shape to feelings he cannot process directly. The crown influences the intensity of these fantasies, but the desire to create them originates from Simon's emotional truth. Simon once lived in a world where knowledge mattered, where imagination played a role in understanding, and where storytelling was an essential part of his intellectual curiosity. These traits remain embedded in the Ice King's personality. His imagination becomes the bridge between emotional residue and fragmented memory. Fantasy becomes the space where he expresses the tenderness he still carries. It becomes the environment where he can explore emotional depth without the confusion he faces in real interactions. These imagined worlds are often filled with companionship, because companionship is the emotion he seeks most intensely. In his fantasies, he is surrounded by people who appreciate him, understand him, and welcome him into their lives. This fantasy does not come from a place of entitlement, it comes from a place of yearning. He constructs these worlds because they reflect the emotional warmth he once experienced. Even though he cannot recall the person who once gave him that warmth, his heart remembers the feeling. Fantasy becomes a way of reaching for that emotional truth. The Ice King often builds these fantasies with meticulous detail. He imagines entire conversations, interactions, and shared adventures. These imagined moments feel real to him because they resonate with the emotional truth embedded inside him. The crown amplifies these feelings, blurring the boundary between imagination and reality. He feels as though he has experienced these moments even when he has not. This confusion deepens his fixation. He begins to believe that the people in his fantasies already have an emotional connection with him. When he encounters them in reality, the emotional resonance from his fantasy shapes his behavior. The weight of these imagined worlds becomes heavy because they feel more stable than the fragmented world inside his mind. In fantasy, he is understood. In reality, he feels lost. Fantasy provides continuity that his memories cannot. It offers a sense of coherence that his emotions lack. When he returns from fantasy to reality, he feels the shock of instability. The emotional gap between these environments intensifies his longing. Obsession becomes the attempt to recreate fantasies in reality, even though reality cannot match the perfect clarity of his imagined worlds. This emotional gap also makes rejection more painful. When someone rejects him, he loses not only their presence in reality, but also the imagined version of them that he carries in his fantasies. This loss feels profound because the imagined connection is emotionally significant. The crown amplifies his emotional response, pushing him into despair. He believes the rejection invalidates the emotional truth of his fantasies. To cope with this pain, he often retreats deeper into imagination. Obsession grows stronger because fantasy becomes the only space where he feels safe and supported. Fantasy also shapes the way he interprets his role within relationships. In his imagined worlds, he often sees himself as a protector, a companion, or a figure of emotional importance. These roles reflect Simon's past. Simon once protected someone he loved. Simon once acted as an emotional anchor. These roles left deep emotional imprints that appear in the Ice King's fantasies, even when he cannot recall the memories associated with them. His imagined heroism is not delusion. It is the echo of a life where he carried responsibility and compassion. Obsession becomes tied to the desire to fulfill an emotional role that he once held. The crown supports these imagined roles because they reinforce the emotional patterns it amplifies. When the Ice King imagines himself as a protector, the crown encourages feelings of urgency and devotion. When he imagines himself as a beloved figure, the crown intensifies feelings of longing and excitement. This reinforcement makes fantasy feel emotionally rewarding. It makes the Ice King feel valued. In reality, he often encounters confusion and rejection. Fantasy provides emotional stability, where reality provides emotional instability. Obsession forms in the space where fantasy feels safer than truth. His imagined worlds often reflect idealized versions of relationships, not because he is naive, but because idealization fills the emotional gaps within him. These idealized relationships contain tenderness, understanding, and affection. They reflect the emotional truth that Simon carried into the crown. The Ice King does not imagine dominance or control. He imagines closeness and warmth. His fantasies reveal the purity of his emotional longing. Despite the crown's distortions, his heart remains grounded in the desire for gentle companionship. This desire fuels his fixation because he believes that the world of fantasy reflects the emotional world he should inhabit. Fantasy shapes his creative expressions as well. His songs, poems, and stories often reflect emotional themes that he does not recognize consciously. The sadness in his music reveals the emotional truth of his lost love. The longing in his stories reveals the depth of his desire for companionship. These creative expressions become the bridge between fantasy and reality. They allow him to reveal parts of himself without confronting the vulnerability that true self-expression would require. Obsession grows in these creative spaces because they allow him to express longing without facing the fear associated with being known. The Ice King's creative imagination also reveals his capacity for self-reflection, even if the reflection is distorted. His fantasies often present him as someone who struggles, someone who feels isolated, someone who wants to be understood. These reflections reveal an emotional awareness that he cannot articulate in direct terms. Fantasy becomes the space where he processes emotions he cannot comprehend in reality. Obsession becomes linked to this processing. He fixates on people who reflect the emotional needs he expresses in his fantasies. He sees them as characters who can play the roles he has created within his imagined stories. When he interacts with these people in reality, his behavior often mirrors the emotional roles he has assigned them in fantasy. This creates confusion because the real people do not share the emotional context of his imagined worlds. The Ice King expects them to respond in ways that make sense within his fantasies, but not within reality. These expectations deepen his fixation because he believes that emotional resonance exists even when it does not. The crown amplifies this belief, encouraging him to pursue the emotional truth he has constructed in his imagination. Fantasy also protects him from the fear of being known. In his imagined worlds, he controls the narrative. He decides when to reveal vulnerability, when to express affection, and when to seek comfort. This control makes fantasy emotionally safe. Real relationships require vulnerability he is not equipped to handle. Fantasy allows him to experience closeness without fear. Obsession becomes the attempt to bring the safety of fantasy into reality, even though reality cannot offer the same emotional predictability. At times, his fantasies reveal flashes of clarity. In rare moments, he imagines memories that come close to Simon's real experiences. These moments are small and fragile. They often appear in dreams or in moments of emotional intensity. In these imagined scenarios, he feels a connection that is different from his usual fantasies. The crown suppresses these moments quickly, but the emotional truth remains. These glimpses deepen his longing because they feel authentic in a way his other fantasies do not. Obsession becomes shaped by these glimpses, even though he cannot identify their origin. These moments of near clarity reveal the tragic reality of his emotional world. He is searching for a memory he cannot access. He is reaching for a love he has forgotten. He is pursuing a feeling that once belonged to Simon. Fantasy gives him a way to explore the emotional truth without confronting the painful absence of memory. Obsession becomes the distorted expression of this exploration. He chases reflections of a life he once lived, unaware of the origin of the feelings that guide him. The weight of his imagined worlds creates a delicate balance within him. Fantasy gives him comfort, but it also deepens his longing. It softens his loneliness, but it also intensifies his fixation. It protects him from vulnerability, but it also isolates him from genuine connection. This balance shapes his emotional life. It creates the space where obsession grows quietly, nurtured by the warmth of imagined love and the confusion of fragmented memory. In the end, the Ice King's fantasies are not illusions meant to deceive himself. They are emotional survival. They are the attempt of a man with a fractured identity to create a sense of coherence. They are the expression of a heart that remembers love even when the mind does not. His obsession grows from this emotional truth. It is built from the warmth of imagined worlds, the ache of memories he cannot reach, and the hope that companionship can restore the emotional fullness he once knew. His fantasies reveal the tenderness that Simon left behind. They reveal the depth of his longing and the sincerity of his heart. The Ice King's fixation cannot be understood without acknowledging how fragile the boundaries inside his mind truly are. For most people, the self has edges, thoughts have limits, emotions have borders. Reality has a clear outline. For the Ice King, these structures have worn thin. The crown's influence blurs the lines between emotion and impulse, imagination and memory, longing and identity. Without firm boundaries, feelings spread across his mind like spilled ink, touching places they were never meant to reach. This internal collapse is not violent. It is quiet, subtle, gradual. It creates a psychological landscape where obsession can grow unchecked because nothing inside him pushes back against its expansion. These blurred boundaries begin with memory. The Ice King's memories exist as fragments, glimpses without context, echoes without source. Without clear memories, he does not know where the past ends and the present begins. A feeling that belongs to Simon can drift into the emotional world of the Ice King without any distinction. A dream that reflects Simon's love can blend into waking longing. A moment of kindness from someone in U can ignite emotional resonance that has nothing to do with the present interaction. The crown amplifies this blending, making it almost impossible for him to separate emotional truth from magical distortion. In this unstable environment, fixation becomes a structural response. Obsession offers him something that feels solid. It becomes the thread that binds his drifting emotions. When he fixates on someone, he feels a sense of continuity. The feeling does not fragment. It does not fade. It gives him a clear direction when everything else feels unfocused. The blurred boundaries inside him make fixation to feel like stability. It is not that he chooses obsession. It is that obsession becomes the only emotional format that feels consistent. It becomes the place where loose feelings gather and take shape. The absence of boundaries also affects how he interprets the behavior of others. When someone interacts with him, he does not experience the moment as a single event. He experiences it as an intersection of emotions, memories, fantasies, and impulses. A simple compliment carries the emotional weight of affection that Simon once felt. A moment of concern echoes the tenderness Simon once received. A gesture of patience reminds him of emotional safety from long ago. These emotional overlays create intensity that others cannot see. To them, it is a small gesture. To him, it is a tidal wave of meaning. Obsession becomes his way of managing this emotional surge, turning overwhelming resonance into a focused attachment. These emotional overlays also influence how he interprets conflict. When someone rejects him, the rejection does not remain isolated. It blends with the ache of lost love, the fear of loneliness, the confusion of blurred memories, and the crown's tendency to magnify negative emotion. Rejection becomes a symbol for every emotional wound he carries. The crown pushes this feeling to the center of his mind, turning it into an urgent crisis. The Ice King responds with fixation, because fixation offers the illusion of repair. If he can restore the connection, he believes he can soothe the emotional chaos inside him. Because he cannot distinguish between emotional timeframes, he often treats new emotional experiences as if they are continuations of something older. When he feels longing for someone he has just met, the longing carries the emotional depth of Simon's past relationships. He does not experience affection gradually. He experiences it all at once because the emotional intensity comes from the remnants of a life he no longer remembers. The crown intensifies this collapse of emotional progression, creating the sudden devotion that defines his fixation. Obsession becomes the attempt to express emotional truth that has no timeline. This collapse of boundaries influences how he experiences identity. Without a clear sense of self, he does not know where his emotions originate. He does not realize that some feelings belong to Simon, while others belong to the crown. He does not understand why certain moments trigger overwhelming responses. When he cannot separate these emotional sources, he interprets all emotional intensity as meaningful. Obsession becomes a method of interpretation. If a feeling is strong, he believes it must reflect a significant connection. This belief turns emotional impulses into entire narratives, shaping his attachment with remarkable speed. The blurred boundaries inside him also affect how he processes desires. The crown often implants impulses that conflict with Simon's emotional truth. These conflicting impulses create internal tension that he cannot interpret. He does not understand why part of him feels tenderness while another part feels urgency. Without boundaries, these impulses blend together. Obsession becomes the synthesis of conflict. It transforms mixed emotion into focused longing. The fixation resolves the tension by giving him a singular emotional direction, even if that direction is misguided. The collapse of boundaries also influences how he responds to solitude. When he is alone, his inner world becomes loud. Emotions drift freely. Fantasies expand. Memory fragments surface, and the crown's influence grows stronger. Without external structure, his thoughts move without order. He feels the pressure of unshaped emotion building inside him. Obsession becomes the outlet for this pressure. It gives him something to focus on, something to orient his emotional energy around. Even if the fixation is unhealthy, it provides a sense of direction that solitude cannot offer. His difficulty with boundaries extends to storytelling. When he creates stories about himself and others, he does not separate fantasy from emotional truth. His stories are not lies. They are attempts to give structure to feelings that lack origin. He imagines relationships not because he wants to deceive, but because these imagined scenarios feel like the correct shape of his emotional world. Obsession becomes intertwined with storytelling because the stories validate his emotional intensity. They give form to longing that comes from a past he cannot remember. The blurred boundaries also affect the way he perceives danger. When the crown senses threat, it pushes fear to the forefront of his mind. This fear merges with emotional vulnerability, creating panic that he cannot explain. He often reacts dramatically because the fear he feels does not align with the reality around him. The crown amplifies the emotional confusion, making him believe that connection is at risk even when it is not. Obsession becomes the attempt to secure emotional stability in the face of perceived danger. He clings to attachment because he believes it will protect him from losing something again. This collapse of boundaries also influences his creative impulses. When he writes or plays music, he often expresses emotions that do not belong entirely to the Ice King. The tenderness in his songs belongs to Simon. The sadness belongs to the emotional void created by memory loss. The crown amplifies both feelings without distinction. His creative expressions become emotional composites of multiple identities. Obsession becomes connected to these expressions because they reveal truths he cannot articulate. His fixation on companionship becomes reflected in the emotional content of his creations. His difficulty separating emotional layers affects the way he understands humour as well. The Ice King's usage of humour often masks emotional instability. When he jokes in moments of tension, the humour is not denial. It is confusion. He uses humour to smooth the blurred boundaries inside him, to give shape to feelings that make him uncomfortable. Humor becomes a coping mechanism for emotional blending. Obsession becomes easier to manage when he wraps it in playful behavior. He treats fixation lightly because the emotional truth beneath it is too heavy to hold directly. The collapse of boundaries also influences how he interacts with objects. He often attaches sentimental meaning to items that remind him of emotional resonance. These items become emotional anchors. A trinket might feel significant because it triggers a memory fragment. A piece of clothing might feel comforting because it echoes the warmth of someone he once loved. These attachments reveal how desperately he tries to create structure within his emotional world. Obsession becomes reinforced by these objects because they give him tangible reminders of emotional truth. The blurred boundaries between self and environment also shape his sense of responsibility. When he imagines himself as a protector, he believes that role reflects a meaningful truth. He does not distinguish between imagined responsibility and real responsibility, because emotional roles have merged inside his mind. Obsession becomes linked to these imagined duties. He feels compelled to fulfill emotional roles that once belonged to Simon but now exist without context. The crown magnifies these feelings, pushing him to act on impulses without understanding their origins. Even though these boundary collapses create emotional instability, they also reveal the depth of his humanity. The Ice King's emotional world contains overlapping truths. The crown's influence does not erase Simon's emotional capacity. It blends it with magical distortion, creating complexity that he cannot navigate. His fixation becomes the attempt to create clarity in a world defined by emotional fusion. Even when he acts impulsively, the feelings behind his actions are real. They reflect a fractured identity doing its best to make sense of a world without edges. In rare moments, the boundaries inside him strengthen. These moments often occur when he experiences a deep emotional trigger that resonates directly with Simon's past. The resonance creates a brief window of clarity. In these moments, he feels the weight of who he used to be. He senses the edges of his lost identity. This clarity brings emotional pain because it exposes the difference between his present self and the person he once was. The crown suppresses these moments quickly, but the emotional truth remains. This truth deepens his longing because it hints at a world he no longer has access to. Obsession becomes fueled by these hints, even though he cannot articulate why. The quiet collapse of boundaries inside the Ice King's mind creates a psychological environment where fixation feels like the only stable structure. Obsession is not a flaw. It is the emotional architecture he builds to survive. It is the method he uses to hold together fragmented feelings, blurred memories, and overlapping identities. It becomes the way he navigates a world without clear lines. It becomes the emotional language he uses to express truths he cannot remember. It becomes the expression of a heart that remains intact even when the mind has lost its shape. Patterns are the unseen architecture of the Ice King's emotional life. They guide him quietly, shaping his choices long before he becomes aware of them. Because his memories are fragmented and the crown's influence is unpredictable, patterns become the only steady structures he can rely on. These patterns are not logical sequences. They are emotional repetitions, echoes of feelings he does not understand. They become habits that he follows instinctively, driven by a mix of memory residue and magical distortion. Obsession becomes one of these patterns, a repeating loop that provides the illusion of continuity in a world where everything else feels unstable. The Ice King does not consciously recognize the patterns that guide him. They emerge from the blurred boundaries inside his mind. When he feels longing, he responds in familiar ways because the emotional path has been worn into him. The pattern repeats because it feels natural, even though he cannot explain why. This lack of understanding makes the pattern stronger. He follows the emotional groove because it feels like the right direction. Obsession becomes the deepest groove in his inner landscape, the pattern that repeats most reliably, the path he takes when everything else inside him feels uncertain. These emotional patterns often begin with the same spark. The spark is small, a moment of kindness, curiosity, or attention. It does not need to be dramatic. The Ice King's heart responds not to grandeur, but to warmth. When he senses warmth from another person, even a brief gesture, it ignites an emotional response that feels both new and familiar. The familiarness comes from Simon's emotional past. The newness comes from the crown's distortion. When these two forces meet, they create a surge that the Ice King interprets as significance. The surge becomes the first step in a repeating cycle. Obsession begins with a spark that resonates across emotional layers he cannot distinguish. Once the spark ignites, the pattern follows a predictable path. First, he feels excitement. This excitement is genuine. It reflects the emotional openness that still lives inside him. Simon's heart was once full of joy at small connections, and that joy survives in the Ice King's responses. The crown amplifies the excitement, making even small gestures feel monumental. This amplification pushes him into fixation. He believes that the emotional intensity must reflect something true and important. He does not understand that the intensity comes from emotional residue rather than the current relationship. After excitement comes imagination. His mind begins to create stories about the person who sparked the emotion. These stories fill in the gaps created by memory loss. He imagines future conversations, shared comfort, moments of companionship. These imagined scenarios mirror emotional truths from Simon's life. They are not fantasies meant to deceive. They are attempts to give structure to emotional resonance. The crown encourages these stories because they deepen his investment. Obsession becomes tied to imagination, forming the second step in the pattern. Next comes confusion. Reality does not match the imagined closeness. Others do not feel the emotional resonance he experiences. They do not share the weight of the spark. This mismatch confuses him. He does not understand why others do not respond with the same intensity. The crown magnifies the confusion, pushing him toward dramatic attempts at connection. He believes that he must act to restore balance. Obsession becomes the behavior that emerges from this confusion, a way to bridge the gap between fantasy and reality. Then comes vulnerability. When his attempts fail, or when others reject his advances, he feels the emotional collapse of the pattern. The collapse is not simply disappointment, it is a return to the emptiness created by memory loss. The emotional contrast between imagined closeness and real distance becomes overwhelming. The crown intensifies this collapse, turning minor rejection into deep emotional wounds. The Ice King experiences a vulnerable shaking of his inner world, as though the pattern has broken in the middle. Obsession becomes stronger in this moment, because fixation feels like a way to repair the emotional break. Finally comes retreat. After the vulnerability, he withdraws into his fantasies or into the solitude of his icy home. This retreat does not erase the emotional pattern. It resets it. He returns to baseline, waiting for the next spark that will ignite the cycle again. The crown ensures that the pattern resets quickly. It encourages emotional repetition because repetition prevents clarity. Obsession becomes the loop that fills the empty spaces between these cycles. It becomes the framework that gives shape to his emotional life. These repeating loops influence how he forms attachments. He does not differentiate between old patterns and new connections. Every attachment follows the familiar emotional path. This familiarity gives him comfort because it makes the world feel predictable. The pattern creates the illusion of emotional stability. Even though obsession causes confusion, the structure of the pattern gives him something to rely on. It becomes a soft rhythm inside his fractured mind, repeating with gentle certainty. This rhythm becomes the heartbeat of his emotional world. The pull of patterns becomes even clearer when he interacts with familiar faces. When he sees someone often, even in small ways, the repetition reinforces emotional resonance. The crown amplifies this reinforcement, turning consistent exposure into increased fixation. Others see the Ice King as unpredictable, but his emotional world is shaped by predictable cycles. He returns to the same people because they fit into the patterns that feel safe. They become emotional landmarks in a world without stable memory. Obsession becomes tied to familiarity rather than uniqueness. These loops also influence the way he interprets danger. When he senses emotional instability, he returns to familiar patterns. He repeats behaviors that once gave him comfort. The crown strengthens these responses, encouraging him to follow emotional grooves rather than forge new paths. This reliance on familiar patterns becomes part of his survival strategy. Without memory to guide him, he depends on repetition to create consistency. Obsession becomes the pattern he trusts most because it is the pattern he feels most deeply. The emotional loops inside him also shape how he understands time. Without clear memory, time becomes defined by cycles instead of continuity. A pattern feels like a timeline. When he repeats a set of emotional steps, it feels like progress. The crown reinforces this illusion. It makes repetition feel meaningful. Obsession becomes anchored in this illusion. He believes that the emotional pattern reflects growth or connection, even when it is simply emotional repetition. The pattern becomes his substitute for narrative, giving his life a sense of progression. These loops reveal the complexity of his emotional resilience. Despite constant instability, he continues to seek connection. He continues to follow emotional patterns that reflect sincerity. The fact that he repeats these cycles shows that he has not given up. He does not collapse into despair. He tries again each time, driven by emotional truth that survives beneath the crown's distortions. Obsession becomes a symbol of this resilience. It is the pattern he returns to because he believes in the possibility of connection. The emotional patterns also shape his relationship with hope. Hope appears at the start of each cycle, gentle and bright. It reflects Simon's optimism. This hope makes him believe that each new spark could lead to genuine companionship. The crown twists this hope into urgency, but the core emotion remains pure. Obsession becomes the form hope takes inside his fragmented identity. It becomes the emotional language through which he expresses his desire for connection. Even when the pattern ends in disappointment, hope returns with the next spark. These patterns also influence his interactions with his own emotions. When he experiences joy, sadness, fear, or curiosity, he responds with the emotional template that has survived the collapse of his identity. This template comes from Simon's emotional world. It contains tenderness, imagination, curiosity, and care. The crown distorts these traits, but they remain the foundation of his patterns. Obsession becomes shaped by these traits. It carries tenderness even when it manifests as fixation. It carries sincerity even when it appears chaotic. It carries hope even when it appears confused. These loops reveal the truth that the Ice King's emotional world is not random. It is structured, but the structure is hidden beneath layers of confusion and magical influence. Obsession becomes one of the clearest indicators of this hidden structure. It follows a rhythm that reflects the emotional imprint of Simon's past. It repeats because the emotional truth that formed it has not disappeared. Even though his identity has fractured, his heart remembers the patterns of love, longing, and companionship. These patterns drive his fixation with quiet persistence. Understanding the pull of these patterns reveals the gentle tragedy of his emotional world. He is not trapped in obsession because he desires control. He is trapped because he desires connection. The patterns he follows are the remnants of emotional truth that survived the collapse of his memories. They guide him even when he cannot understand them. They shape his longing. They shape his imagination. They shape his behavior. Obsession becomes his attempt to follow emotional paths that once led to love, but now lead into the confusion created by the crown. Each loop, each spark, each surge of longing reflects a heart that still believes in the possibility of connection. Even in his fractured state, he continues to follow the patterns of emotion that once defined his life. Obsession becomes both his burden and his guide. It is the quiet rhythm that keeps him moving through a world he cannot fully understand. It is the emotional pattern that reveals the tenderness he carries inside him. It is the repeating cycle that shows the strength of Simon Petrikov's heart. For most people, first impressions are small moments. They might spark curiosity, hesitation, or mild interest, but they rarely define the entire emotional landscape that follows. For the Ice King, first impressions are not small. They are seismic. They shape his emotional world with a force that feels disproportionate to the moment itself. These initial encounters carry weight because they interact directly with the fractured structure of his identity. When he meets someone new, the emotional resonance created by that moment often becomes amplified, distorted, and woven into the patterns that guide his inner life. His fixation does not grow slowly. It ignites from the first spark because first impressions carry a significance that only he can feel. This significance emerges from the collision between emotional residue and magical influence. His heart responds to small gestures of warmth with the sincerity that Simon Petrikov once expressed freely. His mind responds with the confusion created by the crown. These forces meet in the space of first impressions, creating a moment of emotional intensity that he cannot ignore. What someone else might interpret as a passing interaction, he interprets as a meaningful connection. The crown amplifies this interpretation, pushing the emotional signal to the front of his mind. Obsession often begins in these early seconds, not because he leaps to conclusions, but because his emotional world is built around instinct rather than context. When he experiences a first impression, he often feels the emotional impact before he understands the situation. The warmth of a greeting, the softness of a voice, the gentle awareness of kindness hits him with the force of sudden familiarity. This familiarity feels like recognition even when he cannot identify the source. The recognition comes from emotional memory rather than actual experience. The Ice King interprets this resonance as meaningful because it feels like something he has lost. Obsession becomes the attempt to follow the emotional thread that begins in this moment, even though he cannot see where the thread leads. First impressions matter so deeply to him because he does not experience gradual emotional progression. His emotional world does not unfold through stages, it leaps. He feels intensity immediately because the foundation for these emotions already exists inside him. Simon's heart was once capable of deep, immediate connection. That ability remains, but the context is gone. The crown twists the emotional impulse into fixation, preventing it from developing naturally. Obsession becomes the immediate result of resonance rather than the end of a long emotional journey. This immediacy confuses others, but to him, it feels natural because emotional truth arrives fully formed. The fragility of his first impressions becomes even clearer when he experiences moments of vulnerability early in a relationship. If someone shows him patience, understanding, or curiosity, these gestures resonate with emotional truths from Simon's past. The resonance feels deep, almost foundational. It triggers emotional intensity that he cannot regulate. The crown magnifies the vulnerability, making the moment feel like a turning point. The Ice King believes he has found something meaningful because the emotional signal is so strong. Obsession grows from this early vulnerability, becoming intertwined with the belief that the connection is significant. These first impressions also influence how he interprets future interactions. Once he experiences emotional resonance, he views every subsequent moment through the lens created by that initial spark. Kind gestures become evidence of deeper connection. Neutral moments become confusing because they do not align with the emotional intensity he felt initially. The crown distorts his interpretation further, pushing him to magnify positive cues and minimize negative ones. Obsession becomes the narrative through which he views the entire relationship. The emotional truth of the first impression becomes the foundation, even when reality contradicts it. The Ice King's fixation is not rooted in entitlement. It is rooted in emotional consistency. The first impression becomes an emotional anchor in a world defined by instability. Without stable memory, he relies on emotional resonance to create continuity. This continuity gives him comfort because it feels like the closest thing he has to a coherent narrative. The crown knows this and reinforces the emotional anchor, turning it into fixation. Obsession becomes the path he follows because it gives him a sense of stability in a world that often feels unstructured and unpredictable. This reliance on first impressions also shapes the way he responds to rejection. If the first impression was strong, rejection feels impossible to understand. The emotional truth he felt in the first moment does not align with the present rejection. This contradiction creates confusion that he cannot resolve. The crown elevates confusion into panic, pushing him to intensify his fixation as a way to reconcile the contradiction. Obsession becomes an attempt to restore the emotional truth he felt earlier. He cannot accept that the emotional resonance was one-sided because it felt so real. This emotional conflict deepens his longing and fuels the cycle of fixation. His difficulty interpreting first impressions also reveals the emotional vulnerability beneath his eccentricity. He approaches new connections with openness, sincerity, and hope. He does not guard himself. He does not evaluate situations cautiously. The crown prevents him from forming emotional barriers. This openness leaves him exposed. When someone interacts with him kindly, he opens himself fully to the emotional impact. He allows the resonance to shape his inner world without hesitation. Obsession becomes the natural extension of this emotional openness. It is the result of his willingness to trust immediate feelings even when he cannot understand them. The significance of first impressions is connected to his loneliness. He experiences isolation not just as physical solitude, but as emotional disconnection from his own identity. When someone gives him even a small moment of attention, it breaks through the emotional void. The moment becomes amplified by the contrast between connection and isolation. The crown magnifies this contrast, making the emotional signal feel even more intense. Obsession grows from the sudden burst of emotional presence. The Ice King clings to the moment because he fears it will disappear as quickly as it arrived. This fear shapes how he approaches new interactions. He often tries to turn first impressions into lasting connections immediately. This urgency comes from the belief that emotional resonance will fade if he does not act. The Crown supports this belief by pushing feelings of urgency into his mind. He acts quickly, sometimes impulsively, because he is trying to hold on to the emotional spark. Obsession becomes the strategy he uses to secure the connection before it slips away. He does not understand that emotional resonance can grow slowly. He only understands that it can disappear. The blurred boundaries inside his mind make first impressions even more powerful. Without clear distinctions between past, present, and imagined experience, the emotional signal from a first impression blends with memory fragments and fantasy. He feels the warmth of the moment, but he also feels echoes of past kindness and imagined future closeness. These blended emotional layers create an intensity that feels overwhelming. Obsession becomes the attempt to organize the emotional layers into a coherent direction. The fixation gives form to the emotional mixture created by the first impression. His sensitivity to first impressions also influences his creative expressions. After meeting someone who sparks resonance, he often writes songs, stories, or poems that reflect the emotional truth he felt. These creations reveal how deeply the moment affected him. The tenderness in his work shows that the emotional impact is not superficial. It reaches the core of his emotional world. The Crown cannot erase this emotional truth. It can only distort how he responds to it. Obsession becomes the outward expression of the emotional depth that fuels his creativity. Even though first impressions shape his fixation, they also reveal his emotional resilience. He continues to seek connection despite repeated disappointment. Each new encounter brings the possibility of emotional resonance. He approaches each moment with hope, sincerity, and openness. These traits reflect Simon's emotional strength. The Crown has distorted his behavior, but has not destroyed his capacity for genuine feeling. Obsession grows from this capacity. It is the emotional shape his longing takes in the absence of memory and the presence of magical distortion. This emotional resilience makes the Ice King more complex than he appears. He is not simply driven by impulse. He is driven by emotional truth that has survived the collapse of his identity. First impressions feel significant because they awaken this truth. They remind him, even if faintly, of what it once felt like to connect with others. The Crown twists this resonance into fixation, but the origin remains pure. His obsession is built on emotional sincerity. It is built on a heart that continues to yearn for companionship, because companionship was once the foundation of his life. The fragility of first impressions reveals both the tragedy and beauty of his emotional world. He feels emotional truth deeply, but he lacks the context to understand it. He seeks connection with sincerity, but his understanding of intimacy has been distorted. He interprets small moments as significant because they feel significant to the fractured layers of his mind. Obsession becomes the bridge between the emotional truth he carries and the confusion he lives in. It becomes the way he tries to understand the world through the only signals that feel reliable. In the end, first impressions matter so deeply to him because they touch the parts of his heart that still belong to Simon. They awaken emotional truth that the Crown cannot fully suppress. They shape his fixation because they resonate with the love he once knew. His obsession begins in these moments, not because he is unstable, but because he is emotionally honest. He feels deeply, even when he cannot explain why. His fixation becomes the expression of a heart trying to navigate a world where emotional truth is his only guide. Inside the Ice King, emotional memory behaves differently than it does for most people. It does not follow a clear timeline. It does not remain attached to specific moments. It does not serve as a bridge between past and present. Instead, emotional memory floats freely, untethered from context, drifting across his inner world with unpredictable force. These drifting memories shape his longing, his confusion, and the intensity of his fixation. They influence how he interprets kindness, how he responds to loneliness, and how he forms attachments. To understand his obsession, it is necessary to understand how his emotional memory has been altered by the crown, and how those alterations create a landscape where fixation grows naturally. Emotional memory in most people helps form identity. It gives shape to relationships, teaches lessons, and provides coherence to the emotional world. For the Ice King, this coherence has collapsed. The crown has left his factual memories fractured, but his emotional memories remain active. They appear without warning, carried not as stories but as sensations. A feeling of warmth, a flash of grief, a sense of closeness, a moment of fear. These sensations surface without context, creating emotional reactions that feel genuine but disconnected. The Ice King cannot understand why he feels these things, but he trusts them because they feel real. Obsession becomes the attempt to follow these emotional signals even when their origins are lost. The emotional memories that drift through him often come from Simon Petrikov's past. Simon once loved deeply, cared openly, and faced fear with vulnerability. These emotional truths left marks inside him that even the crown could not erase. The love he felt, the tenderness he expressed, and the responsibility he once carried appear in the Ice King's emotional world like echoes rising from the depths. These echoes influence his behavior, even though the memories behind them have faded. When he feels these emotional waves, he interprets them as signals of present connection. He believes that the person he is interacting with must be the source of the emotional memory. Obsession becomes the attempt to interpret the emotional echo. The crown complicates this process by amplifying emotional memory while suppressing factual memory. This imbalance creates intense emotional responses without clarity. When the Ice King feels a wave of affection, he does not know that the affection belongs to a memory. He believes it comes from his current interaction. This misinterpretation deepens his fixation. He feels connected to people not because of shared experience, but because their presence awakens emotional truths that have no context. The crown ensures that these emotional truths appear frequently and unpredictably, making fixation an ongoing struggle rather than a single emotional event. These emotional waves influence how he understands himself. Without factual memory to anchor his emotional life, he interprets feelings as identity. If he feels longing, he believes longing defines him. If he feels affection, he believes he is forming a meaningful connection. If he feels fear, he believes the world around him is unstable. This fluid identity makes emotional memory especially powerful. Each new emotional wave reshapes his sense of self. Obsession becomes the attempt to hold on to one emotional truth long enough to feel stable. It becomes his way of defining himself through the feelings that remain constant rather than through the memories he has lost. The broken pathways of emotional memory also influence his sense of trust. Trust normally grows over time through repeated experiences. The Ice King does not have access to these experiences. He trusts people instantly because he interprets the emotional resonance of the moment as evidence. If he feels safe for a second, he assumes the person is safe. If he feels warmth, he assumes the person cares. This instant trust reflects Simon's emotional truth rather than the present situation. The Crown twists this trust into obsession by magnifying the emotional cue. The Ice King believes the connection is stronger than it is because it resembles the emotional truth of his past. This instant trust makes him vulnerable to disappointment. When others respond to him unpredictably, he cannot understand why. The emotional memory made him believe the connection was strong. Reality contradicts that belief. The contradiction creates confusion that he cannot resolve. The Crown intensifies the confusion, making him feel as though something has been stolen from him. Obsession becomes the attempt to restore the emotional truth he felt, to re-establish connection where he believes it should exist. He pursues the person not out of entitlement, but out of the desperate need to repair the emotional coherence he thought he had discovered. The Ice King's attachment to emotional memory also influences how he perceives himself in relationships. He often behaves as though he has known someone for longer than he has. This behavior is not manipulation. It is the result of emotional memory blending with current interaction. When he feels warmth, he mistakes it for familiarity. He believes he understands the person because the emotional resonance feels deep. This interpretation reflects Simon's emotional sensitivity rather than the Ice King's current situation. Obsession grows from the belief that the connection is long-standing, even when it has just begun. These drifting emotional memories also affect how he experiences loneliness. When he feels the echo of past companionship, the absence of real companionship becomes painfully clear. The emotional memory makes him aware of what he once had without revealing the memory itself. He feels the warmth of the past and the emptiness of the present at the same time. This contrast deepens his longing. The Crown magnifies the longing, making it feel urgent. Obsession becomes the attempt to recreate emotional warmth in the present, even though the warmth originates from a lost past. Sometimes emotional memory appears in the form of sadness. These moments of sadness do not have obvious triggers. They drift through him like fog. He may feel grief without knowing why, sorrow without story, emptiness without explanation. This grief comes from Simon's past. The love Simon lost, the fear he endured, and the sacrifices he made left emotional marks that remain active. The Crown does not erase these marks. It only hides the memories behind them. When the Ice King feels this sadness, he misinterprets it as a sign that something in his life is missing. Obsession becomes the attempt to fill the missing space. Emotional memory also influences his vulnerability to kindness. When someone speaks gently to him, he feels the emotional warmth as though it carries significance. This significance comes from the emotional imprint of Simon's past relationships. The Ice King does not know this, but the emotional weight feels unmistakable. The Crown intensifies the warmth, making it feel momentous. He interprets the gesture as affection. Obsession becomes the attempt to hold on to the feeling, to repeat it, to deepen it. He does not understand that the emotional truth belongs to a memory rather than the moment. These emotional pathways influence his imagination as well. When he imagines companionship, the emotional truth of his fantasy feels real because it aligns with emotional memory. He feels tenderness in his imagined scenarios because Simon once felt tenderness. He feels closeness because Simon once experienced closeness. The Crown does not distinguish between emotional memory and imagination. It amplifies both. The Ice King believes his fantasies reflect possible futures because they feel emotionally true. Obsession becomes linked to these fantasies because they offer clarity in a world where emotional memory lacks structure. The broken pathways of emotional memory also shape how he dreams. His dreams often contain emotional truths that do not appear in his waking mind. In dreams, the emotional residue of Simon's past becomes more accessible. He may feel love, fear, or loss with clarity. When he awakens, the feelings remain, but the memories do not. These lingering emotions deepen his longing. They make him believe that he is missing something important. Obsession becomes the attempt to chase the emotional truth revealed in dreams. Even when he cannot recall the dream itself, the crown exploits these emotional pathways. It amplifies emotional memory because amplified emotion makes him easier to control. When he feels longing, the crown heightens it. When he feels fear, the crown deepens it. When he feels affection, the crown intensifies it. This amplification creates emotional waves that crash against the weakened boundaries of his identity. The Ice King responds with fixation because fixation gives shape to emotional chaos. It turns emotional memory into direction. It becomes the structure that the crown allows him to build. Despite these distortions, the emotional truths inside him remain sincere. The love Simon once carried continues to influence the Ice King's yearning. The tenderness Simon expressed continues to shape the emotional tone of his fixation. The sadness Simon experienced continues to colour his longing. Emotional memory reveals that the Ice King's obsession is not born from madness or selfishness. It is born from emotional truth that survived even when the mind did not. His fixation becomes the expression of emotional memory that refuses to disappear. The broken pathways of emotional memory reveal the tragedy of his inner world. He feels emotional truth deeply, but he cannot understand where it comes from. He responds to emotional resonance honestly, but he misinterprets its meaning. He seeks connection because his heart remembers love, but his mind cannot recall the story of that love. Obsession becomes the bridge between emotional memory and the present, even though the bridge leads him into confusion. It becomes the way he honors the emotional imprint of Simon Petrikov without realizing it. In the end, the Ice King's emotional memory defines his fixation. It shapes his longing, his confusion, his hope, and his despair. It reveals the depth of his humanity, even in his fractured state. His obsession is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of emotional endurance. It is the evidence that Simon's heart continues to survive through him, guiding him quietly through a world that no longer matches the emotional truths he carries. Trust is one of the most fragile elements of the Ice King's emotional world. It is delicate, easily influenced, and deeply tied to the fractured structure of his identity. He does not trust in the way most people do. He does not build trust over time through stable interactions. Instead, he entrusts himself to others suddenly, instinctively, and with complete sincerity. This immediate trust is not foolishness. It is the result of a complex interaction between emotional memory, loneliness, and the crown's influence. To understand his fixation, it is necessary to explore the fragile trust he places in the world, and how that trust becomes entwined with obsession. The Ice King's ability to trust quickly begins with Simon Petrikov's emotional truth. Simon once trusted because he had a stable sense of judgment. He trusted through experience, reason, and empathy. These qualities formed the foundation of his emotional world. Even after the crown fractured his mind, the emotional instinct to trust remained. Yet without memory or context, the instinct lost its boundaries. The Ice King still trusts the way Simon once did, but without the ability to recognize danger or intention. He approaches the world with an open heart he cannot protect. The crown exploits this openness, amplifying the instinct into fixation. Trust for him is not calculated. It arrives in a single moment, when someone addresses him with patience, or looks at him with kindness, or even acknowledges him with simple curiosity. Because he experiences emotional signals immediately and intensely, he interprets these signals as evidence of trustworthiness. This interpretation is not based on reason, but on emotional resonance. The crown magnifies the resonance, making the gesture feel significant. The Ice King responds with trust because it feels emotionally true. His fixation often begins in this space where trust and longing meet. The fragility of his trust becomes clear when he attempts to form connections. He approaches others earnestly, believing that emotional openness will create a pathway to companionship. He offers more trust than others know what to do with. When someone does not return his emotional openness, he becomes confused. He cannot understand why the trust he placed in them was not matched. The crown intensifies this confusion, turning it into emotional urgency. He tries harder to create connection because he believes trust should naturally form closeness. Obsession becomes the attempt to salvage the connection he believes ought to exist. Even when the world treats him harshly, his trust does not disappear. It resets as if he has forgotten the disappointment. This is not denial. It is a consequence of his fractured identity. Without stable memory, he does not store rejection as a learned lesson. He approaches each encounter as if it is new, carrying the same emotional openness that Simon once had. This resetting of trust makes him vulnerable to repeated disappointment. The crown twists each disappointment into urgency rather than caution. Obsession becomes the repeated attempt to turn trust into connection, because trust remains constant even when experiences do not. His trust also influences the way he interprets boundaries. When someone asks for space, he struggles to understand why. Emotional memory tells him that trust should lead to closeness. The crown tells him that closeness should lead to urgency. The absence of boundaries inside his mind makes him interpret space as a sign of emotional instability rather than a healthy need. He believes the other person is withdrawing because he has done something wrong. This belief deepens his longing. The crown magnifies it, pushing him toward fixation. Obsession becomes the attempt to restore trust by reducing distance. Despite these distortions, the core of his trust remains gentle. He trusts not because he seeks advantage, but because he seeks connection. He believes in people because belief feels emotionally truthful. Simon once trusted deeply, and that emotional imprint lives inside him. This truth gives his trust sincerity, even when the crown distorts its expression. His fixation emerges from this sincerity, shaped by emotional truth rather than manipulation or entitlement. Trust for the Ice King is not only about believing in others, it is also about wanting others to believe in him. He longs for validation because it makes him feel anchored. When someone shows even a small amount of understanding, he feels recognized. The recognition resonates with emotional memory from Simon's past. The crown amplifies the recognition, turning it into a powerful emotional experience. The Ice King interprets it as a sign that he has found someone who sees him clearly. Obsession becomes the attempt to deepen this mutual trust, even when the perception is one-sided. This desire to be believed in shapes his behavior in subtle ways. He often tries to impress others with stories or magical displays, not to gain approval, but to confirm the emotional connection he feels. His exaggerations come from insecurity rather than ego. He wants others to share the emotional intensity he experiences. The crown encourages these displays because it transforms insecurity into urgency. Obsession becomes tied to these attempts, shaping his pursuit of connection through emotional performance. The fragility of his trust is also evident when he faces conflict. When someone confronts him, he struggles to separate criticism from danger. Emotional memory tells him that conflict once carried emotional weight. The crown turns that weight into intensity. When someone becomes upset with him, he feels the emotional collapse of trust immediately. This collapse feels catastrophic because it reflects not only the present moment, but the emotional residue of past losses. He does not understand that the conflict is temporary. The crown makes it feel final. Obsession becomes his attempt to repair trust as quickly as possible. He acts impulsively, trying to fix the emotional break before it deepens inside him. His vulnerability to conflict makes him sensitive to tone, expression, and body language. A brief frown, a sigh of frustration, or a moment of silence can feel like the end of trust. This sensitivity arises from the emotional truth of Simon's past, where trust was once stable and betrayal was once devastating. The crown twists this truth into a constant fear of losing trust. The Ice King reacts with fixation because fixation feels like action. It feels like a way to secure the connection. Obsession becomes the emotional response to perceived loss, shaped by anxiety and longing. This emotional vulnerability also affects how he perceives friendship. When someone offers even the smallest gesture of companionship, he interprets it as genuine trust. He treats the gesture as a sign of emotional closeness. Others may not realize how profound their actions feel to him. The Ice King believes the moment means much more than it does. This belief is not misguided. It reflects the emotional truth inside him. The crown intensifies the emotional truth, turning friendship into fixation. The Ice King responds with enthusiasm, generosity, and devotion because he believes the friendship matters deeply. The weight he places on trust also shapes his sense of loyalty. When he trusts someone, he becomes fiercely loyal, even if he cannot articulate why. This loyalty reflects Simon's emotional integrity. The crown has distorted his behavior, but not his moral center. He believes in loyalty because loyalty feels emotionally correct. Obsession becomes intertwined with loyalty because he believes the person he fixates on deserves his devotion. He sees himself as loyal even when the relationship is not reciprocal. Loyalty becomes the emotional core of his fixation. His loyalty reveals the depth of his emotional capacity. Despite his confusion and instability, he remains capable of genuine devotion. This devotion is rooted in emotional memory rather than logic. It makes him vulnerable, but it also reveals his humanity. The crown did not destroy the emotional foundation of Simon Petrikov. It only removed the context. The Ice King's fixation becomes the way he expresses loyalty without understanding its origins. The fragility of his trust becomes especially clear when he faces rejection. Rejection carries tremendous emotional weight because it contradicts the trust he placed in the person. The emotional conflict becomes overwhelming. The crown amplifies the conflict, turning it into urgency or despair. The Ice King responds with fixation because fixation feels like a way to restore emotional stability. He tries to recreate trust even when the relationship has ended. He does not understand that trust must be mutual. He only understands that trust felt real to him. The crown twists this sincerity into persistence. Despite the emotional chaos he carries, the Ice King retains the ability to recover trust quickly. This resilience is rooted in Simon's emotional strength. Simon once rebuilt trust with patience and dignity. The emotional imprint of that strength remains. Even after repeated disappointment, the Ice King approaches new interactions with open trust. He does not become bitter. He does not close himself off. He continues to believe in people because belief is part of his emotional truth. Obsession becomes the emotional shape of this belief in a fractured inner world. His resilience reveals the underlying tenderness of his emotional landscape. He trusts because trust feels honest. He hopes because hope feels familiar. He reaches out because reaching out feels natural. The crown distorts his behavior, but the heart behind his actions remains warm and sincere. Obsession grows from this heart, shaped by emotional truth and magical influence intertwined. In the end, the fragile trust the Ice King places in the world reveals the depth of his emotional honesty. He does not hide behind caution or strategy. He approaches life with the sincerity of someone who still believes in connection despite centuries of confusion. His fixation is not a sign of emotional instability alone. It is the attempt to turn his trust, his hope, and his longing into companionship. It is the expression of a heart that continues to trust even when the mind has forgotten why. It is the emotional truth that Simon Petrikov left behind, still guiding him gently through a world that does not understand the depth of the trust he carries. Inside the Ice King, emotions do not rise and fall with gentle rhythm. They shift suddenly, like weather patterns over an unstable landscape. Warmth appears without warning. Sadness gathers like a cloud. Excitement flares like lightning. Silence settles like fog. These emotional changes happen quickly and without clear source, because the pathways inside his mind have been reshaped by the crown. His inner world does not follow seasons, it follows storms. Each storm influences his fixation, turning longing into urgency or hope into confusion. To understand his obsession, it is necessary to understand the emotional weather that moves through him and how he responds to the ever-shifting atmosphere of his heart. The emotional weather begins with instability. The crown altered the structure of his mind, breaking down the internal processes that regulate emotion. He no longer has the buffers that protect most people from sudden emotional extremes. A spark of fear can turn into panic. A moment of kindness can turn into intense affection. A flash of confusion can turn into fixation. Without these internal buffers, emotional shifts feel large because they arrive with little warning or moderation. Obsession becomes the storm he chases because it gives him a sense of structure in the midst of emotional unpredictability. The unpredictability of his emotions also reflects the fragmented nature of his memory. Without memories to anchor his feelings, emotions rise without context. He feels sadness without understanding why. He feels warmth without identifying its source. He feels fear without a clear danger. These context-free emotions create internal storms. The crown amplifies the storms, pushing emotional signals to the forefront of his awareness. The Ice King responds with instinct rather than understanding. Obsession becomes the attempt to give emotional storms direction. His longing behaves like shifting winds. It changes direction depending on his environment and emotional state. When he encounters someone kind, the winds move toward them, carrying emotional memory and fantasy along with them. When he experiences rejection, the winds scatter, leaving him feeling adrift. These emotional winds reflect both the tenderness of Simon and the instability created by the crown. Obsession becomes the attempt to follow the direction of the winds, even when they shift unpredictably. At times, hope appears like sunlight breaking through clouds. This hope is rooted in Simon's emotional world. He once believed in the possibility of connection, and that belief survived even after the crown altered his mind. The Ice King feels sudden bursts of optimism when he meets someone new or when he imagines companionship. These bursts make him feel grounded for a moment. The crown intensifies the sunlight, making hope feel bright and overwhelming. Obsession becomes the expression of this hope, turning the brightness into pursuit. Sadness appears like rain, soft but persistent. The sadness comes from emotional memory rather than immediate experience. It reflects Simon's past losses and fears. The crown does not erase this sadness, it magnifies it. The Ice King does not understand why he feels the rain inside him, but he responds with longing. He seeks comfort, connection, or reassurance. Obsession becomes tied to the rain, forming whenever he believes someone can lift the sadness by giving him warmth. Confusion enters like fog. The fog blurs his sense of self, making it difficult to distinguish between emotional truth and magical distortion. In the fog, he cannot see boundaries. He cannot interpret signals. He cannot understand why he feels so strongly. The crown deepens the fog, preventing clarity from forming. Obsession becomes the attempt to cut through the fog by clinging to an emotional thread. He believes fixation will lead him out of confusion, even though it often leads him deeper into it. Fear arrives like a sudden storm. It does not grow gradually, it strikes. The crown turns small moments of uncertainty into fear that feels immediate and large. When he senses emotional distance or tension, fear rushes through him like thunder. The Ice King responds by reaching outward, trying to secure connection before the storm grows stronger. Obsession becomes the method he uses to calm the internal storm by pursuing emotional anchors. In the midst of these storms, tenderness appears like warm air. Tenderness is the emotional residue of Simon's heart. It carries softness, care, and genuine affection. This tenderness reaches the Ice King's awareness in small moments, often when he is quiet or reflective. The crown cannot fully distort tenderness because it is rooted in Simon's emotional truth. When the warmth of tenderness spreads through him, he feels connected to something deeper. Obsession softens in these moments because his longing becomes gentle rather than urgent. The emotional weather inside him changes rapidly, often without external triggers. This rapid shifting shapes the intensity of his fixation. When emotional storms pass through him, the fixation strengthens because it provides continuity. Obsession becomes the emotional anchor he holds on to in the midst of instability. It gives him something constant even when the weather changes. The fixation does not replace emotional truth, it organizes it. It turns emotional chaos into a single direction. The unpredictability of his emotional weather makes him sensitive to the emotions of others. He notices subtle changes because his internal storms make him attuned to small signals. If someone appears distant, he feels the shift with full force. If someone appears warm, he feels the warmth deeply. The crown amplifies this sensitivity, making him reactive. Obsession becomes tied to this sensitivity because he believes emotional changes in others reflect significance. He interprets small shifts as signs because emotional truth arrives with such intensity inside him. His sensitivity also makes him empathetic. Even though his behavior seems erratic, he recognizes emotional pain in others. When he sees someone hurting, he feels emotional resonance inside him. This resonance reflects Simon's compassion. The Ice King responds with sincerity, even when his attempts at comfort miss the mark. Obsession becomes intertwined with empathy because he feels deeply responsible for easing emotional storms in others. He wants to help because helping feels emotionally correct. The emotional storms also influence his creativity. When he writes or plays music, his work reflects the emotional weather inside him. His songs carry shifts in tone, mood, and theme because they mirror the storms he experiences. Creativity becomes a safe outlet for emotional weather. It allows him to express feelings without needing to understand them. Obsession becomes easier to manage when he channels emotional storms into creative expression. Music becomes an anchor, softening the intensity of fixation. The crown plays a significant role in shaping his emotional weather. It does not create emotions, it amplifies them. Every spark becomes flare. Every breeze becomes gust. Every drizzle becomes rainstorm. The crown intensifies both emotional truth and emotional confusion. The Ice King cannot separate the crown's influence from his heart because the emotional weather overwhelms him. Obsession becomes a way of navigating the crown's distortions, giving him direction within storms that would otherwise consume him. Despite this instability, patterns emerge within his emotional weather. He often experiences tenderness after sadness, as though emotional memory rises to comfort him. He often feels hope after confusion, revealing Simon's enduring optimism. He often feels longing after moments of quiet, reflecting the emotional emptiness created by memory loss. These patterns show that his emotional world contains internal logic, even when the weather is chaotic. Obsession becomes part of this logic. It forms when emotional storms converge, turning raw feelings into focused direction. His emotional weather influences how he relates to others. He often approaches people with excitement because his hopes rise quickly, like sunlight after rain. When others respond unpredictably, the emotional weather inside him changes again. The storm returns or the fog thickens. He tries to adjust but struggles. Obsession becomes the attempt to create stable emotional conditions through connection, even when stability is impossible. He believes that companionship will calm the storms, not realizing that the storms come from within. At rare times, the emotional weather clears. These moments of calm reveal the depth of Simon's emotional truth. In calm moments, the Ice King feels gentleness, curiosity, and even wisdom. The clarity is brief but meaningful. These moments suggest that his emotional storms are not permanent. They reveal that his heart remains steady beneath the crown's influence. Obsession becomes quieter during these moments because clarity reduces the urgency created by emotional storms. These calm moments are some of the most tragic parts of his emotional journey. They remind him that something inside him remains whole. They give him a glimpse of the emotional truth he has lost. The crown suppresses these moments quickly, restoring instability. But the memory of clarity lingers, even if faintly. The lingering sense pushes him toward fixation because he feels as though connection might restore clarity permanently. He believes companionship will anchor him through the storms. Obsession becomes tied to hope rather than confusion in these moments, making the fixation gentle rather than frantic. In the end, the emotional weather of the Ice King's mind reveals the complexity of his fixation. Obsession is not the result of a single storm. It is the structure he builds in response to ever-shifting emotional conditions. It is the anchor he clings to when winds change and clouds gather. It is the thread that helps him navigate a world where emotions move unpredictably. His fixation reveals the emotional truth that Simon Petrikov left behind. It reveals tenderness, resilience, sincerity, and hope. Despite the storms he faces, his heart continues to reach outward. He believes in connection even when the weather inside him makes it difficult. He seeks companionship even when his emotions overwhelm him. his obsession becomes the emotional map he follows through the storms of his mind. It is not a flaw. It is a reflection of a heart that continues to survive, even when the world inside him shifts like weather across the sky. Beneath every outburst, every confused gesture, every sudden fixation, the Ice King carries a longing that almost never gets acknowledged. It is quiet. It is steady. It lives beneath the storms of his emotional weather, beneath the fog of broken memory, beneath the intensity that defines his interactions with the world. It is the craving for stability, not control, not dominance, not admiration. Stability, a sense of emotional grounding that he can hold on to without fear that it will crumble or vanish. To understand why he fixates, it is necessary to understand how deeply he yearns for a stable world inside himself, and how fixation becomes the structure he uses to approximate that stability. Stability for the Ice King is not an abstract idea. It is an emotional need shaped by the collapse of his identity. When the crown fractured his mind, it removed the foundations that people rely on to feel secure. Memories, routines, relationships, self-knowledge, emotional consistency, all of these stabilizing forces were weakened or destroyed. What remained was a heart filled with tenderness and longing, floating in a mind that could no longer provide anchors. In this unstable inner world, fixation becomes one of the few structures he can hold on to. It gives him a place to direct his feelings, a thread to follow, a sense of purpose that feels solid. This yearning for stability becomes clear when he repeats cycles of behavior. He searches for patterns because patterns give him comfort. Even when the patterns fail to bring him closer to connection, the repetition itself feels grounding. It gives his days shape. It gives his feelings direction. It gives him a sense of being part of something, even if the connection exists more inside him than in reality. The crown exploits this need by amplifying both his desire and the urgency with which he pursues it. Obsession becomes the emotional scaffolding that supports him through instability. The craving for stability also influences how he interprets emotional signals. When someone shows him kindness, the emotional stability he senses in that moment becomes overwhelming. He feels safe. He feels grounded. He feels the emotional equivalent of standing on solid earth after wandering for years. This feeling activates emotional memory from Simon's past, when stability came naturally through love and companionship. The Ice King does not remember these memories, but he feels the echo of them. He believes the person who sparks the feeling must be important because the sensation of stability is so rare. Obsession becomes the attempt to preserve that stability by attaching himself to the source. When the world does not provide stability, he creates it through imagination. His fantasies are not random wishful thinking. They are carefully constructed emotional structures that give him consistency. In his imagined worlds, relationships do not shift unpredictably. People respond to him with warmth he can trust. Reality does not contradict emotional truth. Imagination gives him the stability he cannot find in OO. Obsession becomes tightly tied to these fantasies because they make him feel safe. They become emotional shelters where the storms of his mind cannot reach him. The need for stability also shapes his responses to rejection. Rejection destabilizes him because it breaks the emotional structure he has begun to build around a person. The collapse feels intense because, for a moment, he believed he had found stability. The crown intensifies the emotional impact, making the moment feel devastating. He responds not with anger, but with confusion and desperation. He tries to restore the connection because restoring it feels like the only way to regain emotional footing. Obsession becomes the attempt to rebuild stability, even when the emotional foundation has been removed. His craving for stability influences how he interacts with objects as well. He often attaches sentimental value to certain items because they give him continuity. A prized trinket, a comfort item, a piece of clothing. These objects serve as emotional anchors. They remain constant even when people and emotions shift unpredictably. The objects become symbols of stability. Their presence soothes him. Their absence unsettles him. When his fixation becomes tied to an object, it reflects his attempt to create predictability in a world that often feels chaotic. The Ice King's desire for stability is also visible in his daily routines. He repeats behaviors not because he lacks imagination, but because repetition gives him a feeling of safety. Even the unusual routines he follows, like rehearsing imaginary dialogues or performing dramatic monologues in empty rooms, serve as emotional rituals. These rituals create predictability. They soften the confusion that rises when his emotional weather changes. Obsession becomes intertwined with these rituals because the person he fixates on becomes part of the emotional routine. Despite the chaos he is known for, the Ice King is deeply uncomfortable with unpredictability. When people react to him in unexpected ways, he feels emotionally unmoored. This discomfort shapes his fixation. He gravitates toward people whose behavior appears steady or predictable to him. He interprets their predictability as emotional safety. The crown amplifies this interpretation, turning stable traits into signals of emotional compatibility. Obsession becomes the attempt to align himself with people who appear emotionally consistent. His discomfort with unpredictability also influences his fear of being alone. Solitude becomes a space where his internal instability expands. Without external signals, he feels the full force of emotional weather. Memories float freely, fantasies intensify, fears echo through him, hopes rise without grounding. The absence of stability inside him becomes louder in solitude. This loudness frightens him. Obsession becomes a way to avoid the intensity of solitude by giving him something external to focus on. The Ice King's admiration for consistent relationships in others also reveals his craving for stability. When he observes stable companionship among others, he feels a mix of longing and recognition. The stability he sees reflects emotional truths that remain inside him. These moments remind him of a life he no longer remembers, but still feels the echo of. The crown cannot erase the emotional resonance of seeing stability in others. Obsession becomes tied to these moments because they awaken emotional truth he wishes he could return to. Even his humour reflects his desire for stability. He often uses humour to smooth over emotional unpredictability, both in himself and in others. Humour becomes a stabilizing tool. When he jokes in moments of tension, he is not trying to avoid emotional truth. He is trying to restore emotional balance. He wants interactions to feel gentle. He wants emotional storms to pass quickly. Obsession becomes calmer when humour gives him brief stability. This emotional need also explains the way he responds to tenderness. When someone speaks softly to him or treats him gently, the effect is immediate. The tenderness resonates with emotional memory from Simon's life. It makes him feel stable, grounded, and safe. The crown magnifies the feeling, turning it into emotional intensity. The Ice King believes the person who provided tenderness must hold special significance. Obsession becomes the attempt to preserve that stable moment, to recreate the emotional warmth he felt. In moments of clarity, when the crown's influence weakens, the craving for stability becomes especially poignant. These moments show him what emotional groundedness feels like. He senses echoes of Simon's emotional intelligence, his patience, his steady love. The clarity is brief, but its emotional truth is strong. When the clarity fades, he remembers the feeling even if he cannot recall the context. This memory of stability deepens his longing. Obsession becomes the attempt to reclaim the emotional steadiness he glimpsed. Despite the instability in his mind, the Ice King's craving for stability reveals that he is not lost because he does not care. He is lost because he cares deeply and has no reliable structure to hold that care. His fixation grows from sincerity, not selfishness. His longing grows from tenderness, not malice. His pursuit grows from emotional truth that survived the collapse of his identity. In many ways, the Ice King is trying to rebuild the emotional world Simon once lived in. He does not know this consciously. He cannot articulate it. But the emotional residue of Simon's stable relationships remains active inside him. The crown cannot erase emotional truth. It can only twist its expression. The stability Simon once gave to his loved ones is the stability the Ice King now seeks to receive. Obsession becomes the method through which he tries to recreate that emotional foundation. His craving for stability becomes even more tragic when he is misunderstood. Others often see only the intensity of his fixation. They see the dramatic gestures, the urgent pursuit, the inappropriate assumptions. They do not see the emotional instability beneath those behaviors. They do not see the storm he is trying to quiet. They do not see the longing for emotional safety. The crown prevents him from expressing his vulnerability clearly. Obsession becomes the misunderstood language of his heart. Yet his craving for stability reveals hope as well. Even after years of confusion, he continues to believe in the possibility of steadiness. He continues to hope that companionship could provide emotional grounding. He continues to reach outward, trying to build stability with sincerity. The survival of this hope shows the resilience of Simon's heart. It shows that the crown has not destroyed everything that makes him human. In the end, the quiet craving for stability reveals the emotional truth at the core of his fixation. He longed for stability before the crown. He longs for it still. His obsession is not the pursuit of fantasy alone. It is the attempt to create emotional grounding in a world where internal chaos overwhelms him. It is the expression of a heart that knows what stability once felt like, even if the mind has forgotten. It is the way Simon Petrikov's emotional truth continues to guide the Ice King through the shifting landscape of his fractured identity. The Ice King's obsession is often described from the outside as confusion, eccentricity, or magical distortion. But beneath the layers of chaos, beneath the broken memories and emotional storms, there exists a deeper truth that cannot be erased. It is the echo of Simon Petrikov, the man he once was, the heart he once carried, and the love that never vanished, even when his identity did. This echo does not speak in words. It speaks in longing, tenderness, vulnerability, and instinct. It is the foundation of every emotional surge he experiences. It is the hidden root of his fixation. To understand his obsession completely, it is necessary to understand how Simon's emotional legacy continues to shape him, quietly but profoundly. The Ice King's mind no longer holds the memories of Simon's life, but his heart still knows everything Simon once felt. Emotional memory survives even when factual memory collapses. This truth becomes the core of his longing. He feels the emotional imprint of a love that once defined Simon's world, a love that was gentle, patient, and deeply protective. He does not remember who inspired that love, but he feels the ache of it. The ache becomes part of him. The crown twists the ache into fixation, but the origin remains pure. His obsession grows from a heart that remembers love even when the mind cannot. This emotional legacy creates tensions inside him that he cannot explain. He feels sadness without story, longing without target, tenderness without context. These feelings move through him like echoes traveling across a canyon. They reach him late, distorted, and incomplete, but they remain powerful. When someone shows him warmth, the emotional echo responds with intensity. When someone shows patience, the echo responds with gratitude. These responses come from emotional truth rather than rational understanding. Obsession becomes the attempt to interpret these echoes, to follow the feelings back to their source, even though the source has been hidden from him. Simon once lived with great emotional clarity. He loved deeply. He protected fiercely. He cared with sincerity. The crown has fractured his memories, but it did not erase the emotional pathways built over years of experience. These pathways still guide the Ice King. They influence how he responds to kindness, how he interprets closeness, how he seeks connection. He may appear impulsive or confused, but beneath the surface, his emotional reactions follow Simon's imprint. Obsession becomes the distorted expression of emotional patterns that once belonged to a stable, thoughtful man. The Ice King's longing reflects this emotional continuity. He searches for warmth because Simon once found comfort in it. He yearns for companionship because Simon once built his life around it. He seeks emotional closeness because Simon once understood its importance. The crown has removed the context, but not the truth. Obsession becomes the bridge between Simon's emotional world and the Ice King's fractured identity. It becomes the way he expresses emotional truths that he cannot access consciously. Simon's legacy is also visible in the depth of the Ice King's empathy. Despite his confusion, he recognizes emotional pain in others. He responds with sincerity, offering help in ways that reflect Simon's gentle nature. His empathy often appears in brief moments, when the crown's influence weakens, or when emotional truth becomes too strong to distort. These moments reveal that Simon's heart still lives inside him. Obsession becomes gentler in these moments, shaped more by compassion than urgency. It reflects the emotional truth that Simon once lived by. The Ice King's capacity for devotion is another reflection of Simon's legacy. Simon once loved with unwavering dedication. The crown has twisted this devotion into fixation, but the core emotion remains pure. When the Ice King becomes attached to someone, he does so with the full weight of this emotional inheritance. His devotion is not manipulative. It is earnest, sincere, and rooted in a heart that was once capable of profound love. Obsession becomes the attempt to recreate devotion without understanding its origin. Simon's influence is also visible in the Ice King's fear of losing connection. Simon once faced great loss, and the emotional impact left deep marks. These marks remain active inside the Ice King, shaping how he responds to distance, silence, or rejection. He feels the emotional truth of loss, even when he cannot remember the story behind it. This fear makes him hold tightly to attachments. The crown amplifies the fear into urgency, turning emotional vulnerability into fixation. Obsession becomes the attempt to prevent loss at any cost. The emotional legacy also shows itself in his creativity. When he sings, writes, or expresses himself through art, the emotional tone often reflects Simon's sensitivity. His melodies carry sadness that does not belong to his present. His stories contain longing that comes from the past. His creative work becomes a quiet channel through which Simon's emotional truth escapes. The Ice King cannot identify why his art feels so personal, but the feeling is undeniable. Obsession becomes reflected in this art, shaped by emotional truths he cannot fully articulate. At times, the echo of Simon becomes strong enough to break through the crown's distortions. These moments are rare, delicate, and often fleeting. They reveal clarity that feels both painful and beautiful. The Ice King senses the presence of a deeper self, a self he cannot access but still feels connected to. This connection is emotional, not rational. It makes him feel both grounded and lost. When these moments pass, they leave behind a sense of longing. Obsession becomes stronger because he believes connection might restore the clarity he glimpsed. The crown does not erase Simon, it only hides him. The emotional truth remains, beneath layers of confusion, shaping every part of the Ice King's behavior. His fixation, while distorted, is rooted in emotional stability that Simon once brought into the world. His longing is rooted in love that Simon once gave. His tenderness is rooted in empathy that Simon once lived by. Obsession becomes the outward expression of emotional truths that have survived against impossible odds. This emotional continuity also reveals why the Ice King remains deeply human despite his magical transformation. His behavior may seem absurd, but the emotions behind it reflect sincerity. He feels strongly because Simon once felt strongly. He cares deeply because Simon once cared deeply. He seeks connection because Simon once depended on it. The crown could not erase these qualities. It could only twist their expression. Obsession becomes the distorted portrait of Simon's love, stretched across a fractured mind. The tragedy of his emotional world lies in the fact that he does not understand the source of his feelings. He lives with emotional truths that do not match his present life. He feels echoes of relationships he cannot recall. He responds to emotional cues as though they reflect truths that belong to another time. These echoes lead him toward attachment because they make him believe something significant is missing. Obsession becomes the attempt to fill the void created by emotional dissonance. Despite the tragedy, Simon's emotional echo also brings beauty. It keeps the Ice King from becoming cruel. It keeps him from becoming empty. It keeps him from losing the capacity to love. Even in his most chaotic moments, his heart remains active. It remains vulnerable. It remains capable of tenderness. The crown distorted his mind, but it could not destroy his emotional depth. Obsession becomes a testament to this depth, revealing a man who continues to reach outward despite losing the ability to understand why. Simon's presence inside the Ice King becomes even more clear when he interacts with those who knew him. Even without memory, emotional truth creates a sense of connection. He does not recognize the history, but he feels the resonance. This resonance confuses him because it makes him feel safe in ways he cannot explain. The crown intensifies the confusion, but the emotional truth remains. Obsession becomes quieter in these moments, shaped more by instinct than urgency. The long echo of Simon also reveals why the Ice King never fully loses hope. Hope is one of the strongest emotional truths Simon carried. It survives inside the Ice King, even when the crown twists his behavior. He continues to believe that connection is possible because Simon once believed in the goodness of people. He continues to search for companionship because Simon once depended on love. Obsession becomes the emotional expression of hope in a mind that no longer understands how to hold it. In the end, the Ice King's fixation is not simply the result of magical distortion, loneliness, or instability. It is the result of emotional truth that has survived the collapse of identity. The long echo of Simon Petrikov shapes every part of his emotional world. It influences how he loves, how he fears, how he hopes, and how he reaches toward others. His obsession is the tangled expression of a heart that never stopped loving, even when everything else fell apart. The crown separated Simon's mind from his life, but it could not separate his heart from his soul. The emotional truth survived. It shaped the Ice King's longing. It shaped his tenderness. It shaped his devotion. His fixation becomes the final evidence that Simon Petrikov still lives somewhere inside him, guiding him quietly, even when neither he nor anyone around him can see it clearly. It is the last part of him that never broke.